Chapter 2036. Third update. Sword leaves were money. What do they do with it? Eat, drink, and play. For Qinzong, he only needed to keep a part of it for consumption. As for the rest, he would make the best use of it. To find someone, he would have to spend a lot of money. Hunting Shadow was a lone wolf. He had years of experience and knew many lone wolves. In the country of Fujin, lone wolves were actually the largest group. Moreover, there was an organization called the Lone Wolf Alliance. The Lone Ranger Alliance was a loose organization. There were no obvious rules to speak of, nor was there a hierarchy. Its purpose was to provide a place for Lone Rangers to exchange information and so on. Using this method to find the sword mark imprint, Qinzong might be tracked down instead. However, Qinzong had considered this before. It was fine. It was only a matter of time before he was tracked down. However, he could not wait passively. It would be beneficial for him to take the initiative and obtain more sword marks. Therefore, Qinzong used up all 1,200 golden sword leaves to search for the sword mark imprint with the greatest efficiency and speed. After all, there were only 20 days left. Moreover, when the time was up, the money would be of no use to him. What was left behind were the silver sword leaves, more than 1,000 of them. Even though they were very thin and as light as leaves, 1,000 of them was still not a small amount. Fortunately, the country of Fujin also understood this point and introduced golden sword leaf notes. The smallest note was 10 silver sword leaf note, while the largest was 1,000. 1,000 silver sword leaf notes were equivalent to 10 golden sword leaves. Qinzong exchanged 9 golden sword leaf notes for 1 golden sword leaf note and 9 10 silver sword leaf notes. He could easily carry them with him. As for the remaining 10 silver sword leaves, Qinzong exchanged 1 silver sword leaf for 100 bronze sword leaves. Next, he would wait for the news while comprehending the sword of killing Dao. He was only a step away from comprehending and mastering the sword of killing Dao. Qinzong was confident that as long as he mastered the sword of killing Dao, it would become his strongest move. Of course, there was no limit to the sword. Even if he mastered the sword of killing Dao, he would not stop studying the sword art. Money moves people. With the interest of 1,200 golden sword leaves, the Lone Ranger Alliance became lively. That was because this was a huge sum of money. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Even if they couldn't get it all by themselves, it would be good if they could get a few tenths of it. There were a lot of lone wolves in supporting Sword Country, so it was very convenient for them to exchange information. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye, and Hunting Shadow brought good news. In Qingye City, some people saw similar long swords. This was a clue. The more detailed information was that the owner of the long sword was a member of the Yi clan of Qingye City. Furthermore, he was the last disciple of the number 1 expert of the Yi clan. Qinzong ordered Shadow Hunter to continue collecting information while he immediately set off for Qingye City. Qingye City was much larger than Red Yi City. Qinzong rode a fast horse, and it took him a day to get there. Next, he did some research. The Yi family was the largest family in Qingye City, and the number 1 expert was suspected to be a Sword Dao Grandmaster. As for the final disciple of the number 1 expert, his name was Yi Jianli. Zhang Xian wasn't too sure how strong he was, but he suspected that he was a sword hero. Qinzong couldn't help smiling. Sword hero? How is that possible? Yi Jianli's true strength was definitely above a Sword Dao Grandmaster. He was the number 1 expert of a Yi family. Then, Yi Jianli would be the first person Qinzong killed. Originally, Qinzong had planned to wait until it was late at night before sneaking into the Yi clan. However, he quickly changed his mind because the sword seals would sense each other. As long as they were within 1 kilometer of each other, they would be able to sense each other. Since that was the case, Qinzong decided to send an invitation. An invitation with a sword seal drawn on it was sent to the Yi family, and it was given to Yi Jianli. Is he here? Yi Jianli held the invitation with a sword seal drawn on it and revealed a smile. There was a trace of coldness in the depth of his eyes. He was also looking for the person with the sword seal, but he didn't have any news. He didn't expect someone to come to him. It was a good opportunity to get rid of him. The location of the final battle was in a forest 200 miles away from Qingya City. The battle between two experts who had surpassed the Sword Dao Grandmaster would be destructive. Chenzong wouldn't be merciful, but he wouldn't kill the innocent either. Even now, Chenzong had some doubts about whether this world was real or fake. Regardless of whether it was real or fake, he would not go against his conscience and act recklessly. In the forest outside the city, Chenzong stood in front of a tree and meditated with his eyes closed. A figure in a green robe was running towards him. Yi Jianli. No ambush. Yi Jianli stopped 100 meters away from Chenzong and asked, "Life and death under the sword. Why would there be a need for an ambush?" Chenzong's reply was simple. He thought that Yi Jianli would bring some swordsmen from the Yi family to help him. Even if he wasn't a match for Yi Jianli, it would be good to exhaust his strength. However, Yi Jianli didn't do so, which meant that Yi Jianli had the same idea as him. Life and death under the sword. In an instant, both of their eyes emitted an extremely sharp, cold light. It was like the edge of a sword being unsheathed. It pierced through the sky and collided with each other from 100 meters away. Sparks seemed to have sputtered out. Yi Jianli stomped his feet, and with a bang, dust flew everywhere. His entire body shot out, like an arrow leaving the bow. Like Chenzong, Yi Jianli's cultivation was also sealed. The strength that was left was the limit of an ordinary person's physical strength. They had the same limit and the same level. However, whether they were strong or weak depended on their application and performance. The moment the sword was unsheathed, it stirred up a gust of wind. The gust of wind instantly turned into a gale and whistled out, causing Yi Jianli's speed to increase. Sword of Wind Dao. Close. Chenzong's eyes lit up slightly. It was as dazzling as the sun. In an instant, it seemed to be able to light up the surroundings. The so-called swordsmen and sword masters of the frenzied Sharkwater Stockade were all weaklings. According to Hunter Ying's description, sword masters and sword Dao grandmasters were nothing. The only thing that interested Chenzong was sword Dao grandmasters. However, those at this level were extremely rare and difficult to find. The only ones left were those with sword seal imprints. Those with sword seal imprints were the real opponents. They were the top geniuses from various galaxies in the void. The thought flashed through his mind. Although he was excited, Chenzong's mind was extremely calm. He was not affected in the slightest. In an instant, the sword was unsheathed and turned into a thunderbolt that pierced through the sky. Sword of Thunder Dao. When Yi Jianli's Sword of Wind Dao arrived, a deafening roar suddenly sounded. The power of the wind was integrated with the power of the thunderbolt in an instant. The combination of wind and thunder caused the power of the sword to increase more than twofold. The sword was out of Chenzong's expectation. However, it did not catch Chenzong off guard because Chenzong's reaction was extremely fast. However, the combination of Yi Jianli's Sword of Wind Dao and Sword of Thunder Dao made Chenzong's eyes light up. Ever since the wind, thunder, and fire Dao disappeared, Chenzong did not try to combine them again. Moreover, he did not have the time and energy to do so. Hence, he gave up temporarily. However, Yi Jianli was proficient in the power of wind and thunder. Fight! It was an extremely intense battle. Chenzong struck with his sword. The wind was roaring and the thunder was roaring. The combination of wind and thunder turned into a sword. Yi Jianli was stunned. Yi Jianli actually knew this move too. The power of the Sword of Wind Dao was actually not very strong. It was the same for the Sword of Thunder Dao. However, when the two were combined, the power rose sharply and was comparable to the Sword of Dao Obliteration. Of course, after the combination, Chenzong could feel that his energy consumption was increasing. That was his physical strength and stamina. Take my sword. Yi Jianli was considered a straightforward person. With a low roar, the aura of wind and thunder became extremely violent. The wind was howling and the thunder was rumbling. In an instant, they collided and merged into one. Wrath of wind and thunder. As Yi Jianli's voice fell, he struck with his sword. Ultimacy. This was the fusion ultimacy. It was the combination of the Sword of Wind Dao and Sword of Thunder Dao. Its power was extremely strong, and it made Chunzong's hair stand on end. Chunzong had mastered the Sword of Wind Dao and Sword of Thunder Dao. However, it was not easy to combine the ultimacies. Yi Jianli was able to combine them because he was proficient in Sword Dao and Thunder Dao. Moreover, when he was in the Sword Garden, he had already begun to combine them. Now, he was even more proficient in it. Extermination. Chunzong's low voice was heard at that moment. This was his strongest sword, the Sword of Dao Obliteration's ultimacy. Similarly, ultimacies could be classified into strong and weak ones. The Sword of Dao Obliteration was definitely an extremely strong ultimacy. The power of obliteration gathered in an instant and turned into a gray sword light. It was as if it could destroy everything in the world. As the sword light clashed, an extremely terrifying power was released, and it tore the surroundings apart. The wrath of wind and thunder exploded after 3 breaths. The shockwave from the explosion spread out. Chunzong's sword pierced through and pierced towards Yi Jianli. Yi Jianli quickly retreated. At the same time, he waved his sword to defend himself. However, Chunzong dodged it and pierced through his chest. Yi Jianli was stunned. His chest was pierced through and his heart was pierced through. His strength was quickly draining away, and he no longer had the strength to fight back. Death! Yi Jianli's body quickly faded and disappeared. A sword seal flashed and flew towards Chunzong. It landed on the back of Chunzong's left hand and turned into a brand, overlapping with the original sword seal. At the foot of a mountain in another region of sword-suppressing nation, there was no one around. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew and a shadow appeared out of nowhere. It quickly solidified and landed on the ground. Yi Jianli woke up and quickly recalled what had happened. Only then did he realize that he had been killed and resurrected. He felt a piercing pain on the back of his left hand again, as if there were needles piercing through it. Gradually, a new sword seal appeared on it. This was a new sword seal. With this sword seal, he could sense the aura of other sword seals within a certain range and compete for them. Taking a deep breath, Yi Jianli did not move immediately. Instead, he stood at the same spot and recalled the battle between him and Chunzong. He realized his shortcomings and made improvements. If they were to meet again, he might be able to kill his opponent and take back his sword seal. With 2 sword seals on him, Chunzong tried it out and realized that the sensing range of the sword seal had increased from 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters. This was undoubtedly a good thing. Chapter 2037. After Yi Jianli's death, his body disappeared, leaving behind a sword mark, a few golden sword leaves, and a finger-long white jade bottle. Chunzong quickly put away the golden sword leaves and opened the white jade bottle. A faint smell of herbs, mixed with the fragrance of meat, gushed out from the bottle. His stomach growled and his mouth secreted a lot of saliva, which was aroused by the fragrance. When Chunzong left the city, he had a full meal. Even though the battle had consumed a lot of energy, he was not that hungry. Chunzong poured out the contents of the bottle. It was a white ball about the size of a thumb. It was covered in a layer of membrane. It wasn't hard, but it was very tough. However, Chunzong was confident that he could crush it with his own strength. The fragrance was like a meatball, or a herbal pill, or a combination of the two. Based on Chunzong's knowledge of elixirs and so on, he quickly came to a conclusion. This pill should be made with some herbs mixed with meat. Given its fragrance, it should not be poisonous. Since Yi Jianli carried it with him, it should be something beneficial to his body. He was a Lone Ranger and a newcomer to the Lone Ranger Alliance. He did not know enough about the supporting sword country. Yi Jianli was a member of the Yi family and a very important person. He would know more about him. However, it did not mean that others would not know about him. There was a branch of the Lone Ranger Alliance in Qingye City. The Profound Pill. It was a kind of tonic made from precious herbs and the essence extracted from the meat of fierce beasts. It contained a huge amount of energy. If ordinary people took it, they would either die from overeating or they would not eat, drink, or sleep for 3 days and 3 nights to maintain their vigor. Of course, the Profound Pill was very high-end. Ordinary people could not afford it. Most of the Lone Rangers could not afford it. Even some people from small families could not afford it. Only those powerful families, sect, and other forces could afford it. For a swordsman, the profound pill was the best supplement for cultivation. After high-intensity training, taking the profound pill could replenish the energy consumed by the body and slowly improve the physique. After taking it for a long time, the body would become stronger, approaching or even reaching the limit of the human body. After a high-intensity battle, the profound pill was also an excellent supplement. It could replenish a large amount of energy consumed in a short period of time. For Qinzong, the profound pill was undoubtedly the best supplement. The Yi family was not a small family, but they could not get many profound pills. Therefore, they could only focus on cultivation. As the last disciple of the Yi family's #1 warrior, Yi Jianli, it was a privilege to be able to bring 2 profound pills with him. But now, the profound pills belonged to Qinzong. Qinzong had also made some inquiries. The price of 1 essence yuan pill was 100 golden sword leaves. It was indeed a frighteningly high price. Furthermore, there was a time limit to how long it could be stored. It seems that I have to find some time to earn more money, Qinzong said to himself. Earn more money to buy the profound pills. At least, he could be fully prepared. After all, although the battle between him and Yi Jianli was not long, he had consumed 30% of his energy. The sword of path obliteration would consume even more energy. If he encountered more powerful opponents or more opponents, high-intensity battles would be unavoidable. He must have a way to recover his energy. Then, he would try the effect of the profound pill first. With a few more golden sword leaves, Qinzong rented an independent courtyard in the restaurant and began to practice the sword of path of killing. Control. Qinzong tried hard to control the killing intent and condensed it into the sword to prevent it from leaking out. It was not easy because Qinzong's killing intent was too strong. It would still affect the surroundings. Fortunately, it was only in a small area. Otherwise, it would definitely cause panic. The sword of path of killing at the 5th level could indeed contain all the killing intent in one's body. However, it could not completely contain it, and some of it would leak out. Qinzong estimated that when he could completely contain it, it would be the time for him to truly comprehend the profound meaning. Practice. Qinzong swung the sword very slowly because he was concentrating on controlling the killing intent. He tried his best to condense it into the sword. It was very exhausting, and Qinzong's goal was to exhaust his body. When he felt that he had exhausted most of his energy, he took out a profound pill and peeled off the film. The fragrance instantly became several times stronger, making Qinzong feel even more hungry. When he took a bite, it was very chewy. The fragrance filled his mouth. It was simply a delicacy. When he swallowed it, he felt a surge of heat, and it quickly spread throughout his body. Qinzong sensed it carefully. It was very subtle. His exhaustion was quickly disappearing, and his exhausted energy was quickly recovering. 1 profound qi pill was just enough to restore his physical strength from 70% to 100% in just a few minutes. The exhaustion in his body was also eliminated. However, the profound pill could only work on the body, not the mind. He wondered if there was something similar to the profound pill that could restore the mind. After recovering, Qinzong continued to cultivate the sword of killing Tao. This time, he had used up all of it, but he did not use the remaining profound qi pill. This thing was very precious, and it was better to use it at a critical moment. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Qinzong did not go out except for asking the waiter in the restaurant to send him food. He focused on practicing. It was close. That feeling was about to burst out. In an instant, when Qinzong pointed his sword in front of him, his eyes focused, and his essence, qi, and spirit were also highly unified. They were all integrated into one, and there was no distinction between them. Endless killing intent, murderous intent, and murderous intent were all integrated into the sword. There was not a trace of it around. On the sword ridge, a spot of blood light suddenly condensed and quickly spread to the sword tip. It did not emit any aura, but it gave off a very terrifying feeling. In the end, Chunzong did not launch the sword, and the blood light dissipated. Chunzong exhaled. He knew that he had mastered the sword of killing. He was sure that this was a very terrifying sword. Its power was definitely stronger than the sword of annihilation, and it would become his strongest sword. In that case, what should he cultivate next? The sword of the way of wind and the sword of the way of thunder could be fused together. In that case, could the sword of the way of fire be fused together as well? If the sword of wind, sword of thunder, and sword of fire were combined, the power of each sword would definitely increase tremendously. However, something unexpected happened. The sword mark on his left hand flashed, and Chunzong knew that someone was approaching. Moreover, it was the person with the sword mark. In Qingye City, other than Yi Jianli, who had been killed by him and resurrected, was there any other person with the sword mark? Or had Yi Jianli returned? Chunzong immediately walked out of the courtyard, out of the restaurant, and onto the street. The aura of the sword mark was rapidly approaching. The street was long. "I've found you." A voice full of malice was heard, and immediately a terrifying sword light pierced through the air. Sword of killing. This person unleashed his murderous intent without any hesitation. It turned into a surging blood-colored mist that surged forward. Different from Chunzong's sword of killing Dao, this person released his killing intent without restraint and did not retract it. The bloody mist surged like ceaseless waves, and killing intent surged like the tide as it struck towards Chunzong. At the same time, the people around him were engulfed by the terrifying killing intent. Their minds went blank, and they trembled and felt numb. They had no choice but to move. At that moment, they felt that they were going to be killed. Even if this level of killing intent was not directed at them, it would still affect them mentally. It was certain that these people would be left with sequelae, and they might even become mentally retarded. However, Chunzong could not care less about this. This person's killing intent was very strong, and so was his strength. The sword light flashed, and it seemed to cross the void in an instant. It was a very fast sword, and it was also a very terrifying sword. It attacked directly without holding back. At that moment, Chunzong felt like he was drowned in the killing intent. The strength of the sword of killing lay in its killing intent. It could affect people and cause their spiritual will to be impacted, and they would fall into a state of panic or a state of soaring killing intent. No matter what state they were in, it would affect the performance of their strength. However, this kind of killing intent was nothing to him. Then, let's try the power of slaughter, Chunzong said to himself. In such a place, if a fierce battle broke out, the damage would be shocking and many innocent people would be affected. It was not what he wanted. Another point was to avoid other accidents. Therefore, ending the battle in the shortest time was undoubtedly the best way to save energy. Then, he directly used his most powerful sword. Chunzong named that sword as slaughter. It was the profound meaning of the sword of killing. Slaughter. Slaughter everything, kill everything. This sword had just been comprehended, and there were people who were strong enough to try its power. A wisp of blood suddenly condensed on the spine of the sword and quickly spread to the tip of the sword. Finally, it completely condensed into a spot of bloodlight at the tip of the sword. It was the combination of Chunzong's killing intent, and killing intent. The most powerful sword. Kill. The person holding the sword and using the sword of killing was suddenly stunned. Chunzong's sword did not leak any aura, but in that instant, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if it was a warning from the deepest part of his heart. This sword was very terrifying. It was an extremely terrifying sword. If he could not block it, he would die. Explode. He exploded with all his strength, and all his strength burst out. In an instant, the endless blood mist became extremely violent. It condensed into a sword light and shot down from the sky. Profound meaning. Profound meaning of the sword of killing. The collision of profound meanings. Chunzong's sword pressed forward. All his strength was condensed into a single point. That single point could penetrate everything, penetrate the stars and break the moon and destroy everything. Under that sword, The opponent's sword of killing's profound meaning was immediately penetrated. It was like a hot knife through butter, and there was no way to resist. Then, it pierced through the opponent's forehead. The man's fierce face was full of shock. How could it be? What kind of profound meaning was this? It could actually break through his profound meaning with one sword and kill him. It was unbelievable. Chapter 2038. Second update. Time flew by and the sand between one's fingers could not be grasped tightly. The past could not be retained. Half a month had passed. There were 3 figures in a secret hall of the royal family of suppressing sword country. Your Highness, all the information has been collected. It's all here. A gloomy voice was heard, but there was no reply. It was as though the voice disappeared into nothingness. It was very strange. Oh, very good. A light voice was heard, and it was filled with carelessness. Then there was the sound of someone flipping through a book. Sword ghost, sword demon, sword maniac. Hee, all sorts of monsters have really appeared. Your Highness, according to initial estimates, these people have at least 100 sword seals. The gloomy voice was filled with excitement. 100 sword seals. If they were all killed, they would be able to obtain hundreds of sword seals. What a shocking number. The breathing of the 3 people in the secret hall quickened. Your Highness, the net has been laid. Should we close it? Another voice was heard, and it was filled with a sharp, killing intent. No, wait a little longer. It's not the right time yet. Wait a little longer. Wait until the end. It'll be the time for the big harvest. All the voices were silenced. The secret hall returned to dead silence, as though there was no one in sight. Thousand Blades Mountain. This was a famous mountain in suppressing sword country. It was famous because there was a mountain stronghold on Thousand Blades Mountain called Thousand Blade Stronghold. It was a bandit group. Thousand Blade Stronghold had existed for decades because the mountain was rugged and difficult to climb. It was easy to defend, but difficult to attack. In addition, there were thousands of bandits in Thousand Blade Stronghold, and they were guarded by heavy crossbows. There were also hundreds of expert swordsmen, and their leader was a veteran sword principal grandmaster. If suppressing sword country wanted to eliminate such a bandit group, they would have to use at least several times the number of soldiers and experts. They would also have to pay a high price. Even a sword principal grandmaster could not guarantee that they could eliminate the bandit group. After all, there were heavy crossbows that could break through the city walls. Once a sword principal grandmaster was hit by such a heavy crossbow, he would be killed instantly. The price to pay to eliminate Thousand Blade Stronghold was too high. Therefore, Thousand Blade Stronghold could exist for decades and develop continuously to become one of the strongest forces in the world. There were too few forces that could have a sword principal grandmaster. Moreover, a sword principal grandmaster had high status. Grandmasters who became sword principal grandmasters could enjoy the country's offerings. The Thousand Blades Mountain was like a huge, sharp blade that pointed to the sky. It was over 1,000 meters tall, and there were no plants growing on the mountain. Instead, it was filled with steep rocks. The only path was a winding path that could barely allow 2 people to walk side by side. A silhouette appeared and killed the 2 bandits on guard at the foot of the mountain before quickly climbing the mountain. This was because Chun Zong had sensed the presence of a sword mark on the mountain. In an instant, hundreds of sharp arrows pierced through the air. Every one of them was a well-trained archer with good archery skills. Shooting arrows from a high vantage point, without a doubt, they had the advantage of the terrain. Coupled with their well-trained skills, the hundreds of arrows were like a swarm of flying locusts. It was very frightening, and it made Chun Zong's hair stand on end. This was the 30th sword mark branded person that Chun Zong had found through the Lone Ranger Alliance. In addition, there were also sword mark branded people who met on their own. Chun Zong now had more than 40 sword mark branded people on the back of his left hand. He could sense the fluctuations of other sword marks within a range of more than 40,000 meters. Shoot him to death. In Thousand Blades Stronghold on Thousand Blades Mountain, a young man with a black eye patch over his left eye had disheveled hair and a ferocious look on his face. He was the one who had been branded with the sword mark, and he was also the current chief of the Thousand-Blade Stronghold. As for the chief of the Thousand-Blade Stronghold, who was a veteran Sword Dao Grandmaster, he had already killed him in front of everyone. The other members of the Thousand-Blade Stronghold submitted to him because those who didn't submit had already been eliminated. In the stronghold, 2 large heavy crossbows had already been set up with huge bolts as thick as thighs. They were constantly adjusting their angles and aiming at Qinzong. This large heavy crossbow was a siege crossbow. With one shot, it could directly shatter a thick city gate. Even the hardest city walls would be destroyed. It was very powerful. It was easier to attack a city gate or city wall because the target was large. However, it was more difficult to use it to attack a moving swordsman. It had to be constantly adjusted according to the opponent's movements. It also required a high level of judgment, and so on. This required a very experienced crossbowman. Such crossbowmen were rare and precious. However, Thousand Blade Stronghold happened to have 2 of them. Hundreds of arrows were aimed at Qinzong as they pierced through the air. Qinzong's figure became ethereal in an instant, as if he was swaying in the wind, leaving behind afterimages. He unsheathed his sword and stirred up a whirlwind. It swept through the surroundings and covered a radius of 10 meters. When the arrows entered the 10-meter radius, they were all swept away by the whirlwind and slowed down. The closer they got to Qinzong, the more powerless they became. They were all dodged by Qinzong. How is this possible? The hundreds of strong archers' expressions changed drastically. It was simply unbelievable. Even a Grandmaster swordsman could not do it. I'll do it. Third bandit chief picked up a strong bow, aimed, and fired. After the sharp arrow was shot, an extremely sharp and terrifying sound was heard. This arrow immediately made Qinzong's hair stand on end. It was as if he would be shot through. He swung his sword. Slash! The sharp arrow was shot, but it was instantly slashed away by Qinzong's sword. Rushing forward, Qinzong burst forth with astonishing speed, flying up rapidly. 2 muffled sounds were heard at the same time. It was the sound of a heavy crossbow being fired. The sound was as terrifying as a tsunami. It tore through a hurricane and carried a terrifying power that could shatter everything. It shot from 2 directions. Fast, fierce, extremely terrifying. Qinzong felt suffocated. Even if his body had reached the limit of a human body, he could not resist such a killing weapon. As soon as he touched it, he would be hit and shattered. His heartbeat reached its peak in an instant. The sound of the wind became distant. Everything in front of him seemed to be stretched and distorted. It was like a dream. Everything had become so unreal. Thump, thump, thump. His heart beat wildly, and his blood gushed out like a flood breaking through a dam. The powerful force, like a volcanic eruption, instantly rushed to his limbs and bones. His feet kicked on the stone stairs of the mountain path. The stairs were shattered. Qinzong rushed forward. The sword in his hand turned into a roaring wind and thunder in an instant. It was as if it could cut through everything. In an instant, 2 sharp sounds were heard. The long sword vibrated. Qinzong only felt 2 forces rushing through the sword, as if they were going to shatter his palm. At the same time, his body also shuttled between the heavy crossbows. The 2 heavy crossbows crossed each other and shot down a mountain. They hit 2 boulders that weighed thousands of kilograms. With a boom, the boulders were smashed into pieces. Stone fragments sputtered. In a world of ordinary people, this kind of power was terrifying. Go! Another round of arrows was shot, but Qinzong dodged them one by one. There was nothing he could do. Then, Qinzong shook his left hand. 10 copper sword leaves appeared in his hand. He threw them out in an instant. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The 10 copper sword leaves turned into 10 streams of light and cut through the necks of 10 archers in an instant. Blood spurted out. Many people knew that money could kill, because as long as you paid enough money, you could get someone to kill for you. But it was the first time they had seen people kill with money. Another 10 copper sword leaves. Soon, hundreds of archers were shot to death. Qinzong also rushed into the mountain stronghold. His body moved like the wind, killing one with every step. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. The young man with the eye patch over his left eye carried a long sword on his back. He walked over while clapping his hands. With a playful smile on his face, he said, "But now, how much strength do you have left?" Indeed, climbing up from the foot of the mountain required a bit of energy. Furthermore, they had to face wave after wave of arrows, which also consumed a lot of energy, especially the attacks of the two heavy crossbows, which consumed a lot of energy in an instant. It also consumed a lot of strength to rush into the mountain stronghold and kill hundreds of archers. This was the outside world. He could use all his cultivation. His body was only at the level of an ordinary person. "It's enough to kill you," Chunzong said unhurriedly. "Is that so? In that case, then." The one-eyed man waved his hand. Suddenly, the other bandits rushed in from all directions with swords in their hands. There were more than 1,000 people. Even if they stood there and let him kill, it would take a long time and a lot of strength to kill. There is no doubt that the opponent's purpose was to consume his strength. Without the slightest hesitation, Chunzong immediately bit into a profound chi pill that was already in his mouth. A warm current surged within his body and quickly spread out, replenishing the energy he had consumed. Chunzong held his sword and rushed directly to the one-eyed man without hesitation. Behead. Otherwise, even with the essential chi pill, he would be exhausted after killing more than 1,000 bandits. The one-eyed man did not intend to fight with Chunzong, at least not now. He planned to consume Chunzong's strength first and then kill him in the end. He was waiting for the enemy to come to him. Chunzong waved his hand, and the copper leaf flew out again, killing the bandits in front of him. He was as fast as the wind and as fast as a cheetah. Go, go, go. He rushed out and left a bloody path. With the sword in hand, no one in the world could stop him. This kind of belief was shocking. The sword of killing. This time around, Chunzong unleashed all of his killing intent, blasting out in all directions. The bandits who surrounded him were all stunned. They felt their minds go blank and their bodies trembled uncontrollably. They were inexplicably frightened. Chunzong passed by them and approached the one-eyed man. "You're really difficult to deal with. So, I have to kill you myself." The one-eyed man seemed to be helpless, but his right eye was full of ridicule. Chapter 2039. Third update. Left-handed sword. Left-handed sword was often more tricky and difficult to guard against than right-handed sword. Of course, left-handed sword was also more difficult to practice and control than right-handed sword. But if one practiced it well, left-handed sword would be very scary. Chunzong felt that the one-eyed man in front of him would be a strong opponent. But so what? The killing intent burst out, and the bloody light surged like a tide, making it impossible for people to get close. The one-eyed man also felt depressed. What kind of terrifying killing intent was this? Just how many people had he killed? Could it be that he grew up in the azure field? The banter in his right eye disappeared and was replaced by seriousness. In an instant, the one-eyed man turned into a black shadow, as if blending into the surroundings, spreading out like a drop of ink in water. Sword of Dark Path. In his hands, this sword technique bloomed with a different style. It seemed to have merged with the mystery of shadow. The black shadow spread out, filling the surroundings. Then, from the side, a black shadow broke through the air silently. It was secretive and tricky, and unusually fast, so that Chunzong couldn't perceive it. He was almost stabbed. With such a body, if he was stabbed, he would definitely be seriously injured, or even killed. Then, close your eyes. With both eyes closed, the world in front of him turned into darkness and disappeared. His eardrums closed. 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 His 5 senses were sealed. Absolute darkness came. But in an instant, there seemed to be light everywhere. Mind's eye. Open. Within a radius of 10 meters, everything was under his control. The mind's eye was not sealed. However, Chunzong also discovered one point. Opening the heart's eye in this place, the rate of consumption of one's mind was 10 times that of the outside world. From the looks of it, it was not that the heart's eye was not sealed, but it was not completely sealed. 10 times more mind power consumption meant that he couldn't keep the mind's eye open for a long time. The battle must end as soon as possible. Within the range of the mind's eye, the one-eyed man's figure was completely exposed, and he couldn't hide at all. He only needed an opportunity, a suitable opportunity. Slaughter. The strongest sword attack was instantly launched. The bloody light condensed and rushed to the tip of the sword. The one-eyed man's right eye suddenly widened. Was he discovered? He had constantly improved the dark path to another level, and it was completely suitable for him. How could he be discovered? There was no time to think. Chunzong's sword had already arrived. It was an extremely terrifying strike, a strike that determined life and death. An unstoppable sword. When the sword arrived, a terrifying killing intent erupted, causing the one-eyed man's mind to tremble. It was as if a trace of emptiness had appeared in his mind. Life and death were separated. The sword was pulled out of the one-eyed man's heart. The one-eyed man looked at Chunzong in a daze, and then his body turned into light spots and shattered. 13 sword seals flew to the back of Chunzong's left hand. One of them belonged to the one-eyed man, and the other 12 belonged to him. But now they all belonged to Chunzong. As for the other bandits, Chunzong didn't kill them because he didn't accept any tasks this time. However, the treasure had to be taken away. One had to know that one essence pill was worth 100 golden sword leaves. In addition, there was also the spirit-nourishing pill, which was something that could nourish and restore one's spirit. It was made from very precious herbs, and its value was even higher than the essence pill. One pill cost 500 golden sword leaves. It was an amazing value. Therefore, Chunzong found that there were too many things that he needed money for. He had to earn more money to buy some essence pills and spirit-nourishing pills. These things were also helpful for his swordsmanship practice. When he was tired, he could eat them to quickly replenish his energy. He could also practice his swordsmanship very efficiently. Recently, his swordsmanship had improved a lot, collecting treasures. In the end, Chunzong got a lot of treasures from the Thousand Blade Stockade, which was very amazing. There were a total of 30 golden sword leaf banknotes with the denomination of 1,000 and 120 golden sword leaf banknotes with the denomination of 100. How much was that? It was the value of 42,000 golden sword leaves. In addition, there were thousands of golden sword leaf notes with a value of 10, tens of thousands of silver sword leaf notes, and some jewelry and so on. The Thousand Blade Stockade had accumulated wealth for decades. Apart from the expenses, the remaining wealth was worth nearly 100,000 golden sword leaves. 100,000 golden sword leaves. How amazing was that? It meant that he could buy 1,000 essence pills or 200 spirit-nourishing pills. Of course, Chunzong would buy them separately. Very good. He had gained a lot. With a lot of wealth, Chunzong quickly left the Thousand Blade Stockade. Henceforth, the Thousand Blade Stockade would be reduced to a small force and even face disintegration. Because the experts in the stockade were all dead, the most powerful ones left were the swordsmen at the swordsman level. Such a force could no longer make any waves. After returning to the Thousand Blade City, Chunzong immediately used the money he had received to buy essence pills and spirit-nourishing pills. 100 spirit-nourishing pills and 500 essence pills were worth a total of 100,000 golden sword leaves. Chunzong happened to have them. However, with such a huge transaction, the Chamber of Commerce could not take out so many spirit-nourishing pills and essence pills in a short time. They could only take out part of their inventory and transfer the rest. They had to deliver the goods within 5 days. In this way, Chunzong got 40 spirit-nourishing pills and 200 essence pills first. He had to wait for 4 or 5 days for the rest. Then, I'll take advantage of these 4 or 5 days to improve my swordsmanship, Chunzong thought to himself. Every single one of the 1,000 sword cultivators who had passed the sword garden sword discussion could be said to be outstanding in their own way. Even if it was just a sword of the way of wind or the way of thunder, they would still be able to display different powers and profundities. Each had its own merits. So far, after dozens of battles, Chunzong had gained a lot. Because of this, Chunzong increasingly felt that there was no end to swordsmanship. He increasingly felt that this competition would not be so simple. Another thing was that Chun Zong began to have an ominous feeling. It was a feeling that came from the deepest part of his heart. There seemed to be a shadow over the sword country, because Chun Zong's perception was very sharp. Although the heart sword essence was sealed, some of the mysteries of the heart sword essence still existed. It was like an instinct. This feeling made Chun Zong feel uneasy. In order to eliminate this uneasiness, he had to improve himself. As long as he was strong enough, he could face everything head-on. Whether it was a conspiracy or an overt plot, they would all be crushed by his powerful sword. With the supplement of the profound Qi pill and the spirit-nourishing pill, Chun Zong's swordsmanship exceeded the load, the limit, and himself again. Innovate from the old. Integrate. Without any accident, he got the profound Qi pill and the spirit-nourishing pill on the 4th day. Now, there were only 10 days left before the competition ended. When Chun Zong returned to the courtyard of the restaurant, a post was lying quietly on the table in the room. When he opened the post, there was only one sentence on it. "I'll be waiting for you at Sword Mountain." There was no signature, no target, just a very simple sentence. But when Chun Zong saw it, he suddenly understood that this sentence was meant for him. Sword Mountain. When he saw this sentence, the haze in Chun Zong's heart seemed to suddenly clear up. It was as if the clouds were dispelled and the moon was revealed. Then, he would go to Sword Mountain, because Chun Zong felt that there might be more than one person who had received such a post. Perhaps he set off for Sword Mountain. Sword Mountain? Is this the place for the final battle? Interesting. As Chun Zong expected, he was not the only one who had received the post. Others had also received it. One by one, the sword mark branded people started to move. 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 Sword Mountain, that will be my chance to overtake them. Taking the profound Qi pill, the spirit-nourishing pill, the dry food, and water, he exchanged some copper sword leaves. Riding a horse, Chun Zong left Thousand Blades City and went to Sword Mountain. Sword Mountain was the highest peak in Sword Country. It was the most famous mountain in Sword Country. Its shape was like a giant sword, and it was nearly 3,000 meters high. It took Chun Zong 3 days to reach the foot of the supporting Sword Mountain from the Thousand Blade City on horseback. The mountain stood tall and majestic, like a giant sword pointing to the sky. It seemed to be filled with an amazing aura, like sword Qi soaring to the sky. With the sword mark in his hand, Chun Zong sensed the existence of other sword mark branded people. There were dozens of them, and they were all on the mountain. These people had arrived earlier than him. But what was interesting was that no one seemed to be fighting. Chun Zong climbed up the mountain. When he was halfway up the mountain, Chun Zong saw a flat ground. It was very wide. Looking at the marks, it seemed to be man-made. Moreover, it was newly created. Halfway up the mountain, there was actually a large flat ground that was specially created. It was really amazing. It took a lot of time and manpower to create a place with such a level of martial power. At this moment, there were dozens of people on the flat ground. Through sensing, Chun Zong could sense the identity of these people. They were all sword mark branded people. Each of them looked like they were about to pull out their swords and kill, but they had some scruples. In such a world, with such a body, there were many restrictions. Many of the original methods could not be used. Therefore, their fighting strength was also limited. Once they killed, even if they won, they would not be able to continuously defeat these people. In the end, they would only benefit others. Although the atmosphere was very bleak, no one made a move. Chun Zong also did not make a move. He just stood there casually. Who sent the post? Was this person among the people who asked everyone to gather at Sword Mountain? Or did he not appear? Then let's wait. No matter if he was already here or not, the truth would come out. Moreover, it would not take long. Chun Zong was confident that he would not be inferior to anyone at the same level of physical strength. Time passed slowly. Chun Zong paid attention to the movements around him while meditating. He did not miss a single breath of time. More and more sword mark branded people came to Sword Mountain and began to climb. Soon, the number of sword mark branded people exceeded 100. Soon night fell. The mountain wind was chilly, bringing the coolness of the night. Shenzong ate some dry food to maintain his physical strength. He also took a little rest to ensure that his spirit was at its peak. As the day came, more and more sword-marked branded people came and climbed the mountain. Shenzong saw the young commander of the Heavenly Punishment Army and the eldest senior brother of the Fengling sect. The two also saw Shenzong, but they did not say anything. 200 people. Soon, the number of people exceeded 200, more than 1/5 of the total number of people. Chapter 2040. This wait lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. In order to maintain his body's strength at its peak, Shenzong had no choice but to take an essence pill and a spirit-nourishing pill. Meanwhile, the number of sword-mark branded individuals that had gathered at Sword Mountain had exceeded 300, close to 400. More than half of these 400 people had quite a number of sword marks. There were at least 10 of them, and some even had over 100 of them. Their aura was very terrifying, and no one dared to approach them. Who is it? Sword Demon, who was wearing a devil's face mask, exuded an extremely frightening aura of gloom. His murderous intent permeated the entire area as his bloodshot eyes swept across the crowd, causing everyone to involuntarily tense up. Who was the one who posted the thread? Step forward. After waiting for 3 days and 3 nights, everyone was already impatient. Come out! How dare you tease us like this? It was as if it had been detonated. All the dissatisfaction and anger were vented out in an instant. The terrifying aura also surged in all directions, making an astonishing roar as if it was going to collapse the entire sword-suppressing mountain. When the dissatisfaction accumulated to the extreme, and when the anger erupted, the scene would fall into chaos. Everyone had received the invitation. In their opinion, it should be a battle invitation. There was a sword seal branded person who wanted to have a decisive battle with them at Fu Sword Mountain. The winner would obtain the opponent's sword seal, while the loser would lose all of his sword seals. As for whether it was a conspiracy or not, everyone had thought about it. But in the end, they still decided to come, because everyone guessed that they might not be the only one who had received the invitation, and there might be more people. This meant that they could meet other sword-mark branded individuals in Sword Mountain. In this way, they didn't have to waste their time looking for others. They just needed to come to Sword Mountain. Battle. None of them were fools. They were already prepared to face a conspiracy. After all, everyone had experienced countless life and death battles. They had encountered many kinds of situations. No one had cultivated smoothly. Sometimes, even if they knew that there was a conspiracy, they would still go without hesitation. First, it was because they were confident in themselves. Second, it was because it was attractive enough. However, after staying in a mountain for 3 days and 3 nights, the person who had sent the invitation did not show up. This made some people's patience reach a critical point. After all, the environment here was not good. Moreover, the group was not at the level where they did not fear water, fire, or heat, but ordinary people whose supernatural powers were sealed. Even if he had reached the limits of the human body, he would still feel uncomfortable. You're the one who issued the challenge, right? Suddenly, someone stared at the person next to him. At the same time, a long sword was unsheathed. A terrifying bolt of lightning swept out, carrying a violent might that could destroy everything in its path. You are courting death. The person who was pointed out as the one who issued the challenge was instantly enraged. He was already full of anger, and now that he was being framed and attacked directly by the other party, the anger in his heart was ignited in an instant. He did not hesitate to unsheath his sword, and like a flash flood, he attacked. Fight! Flames of fury erupted, and sword energy surged. The collision swept out in all directions. What are you looking at? Come and die. A cold voice pierced through the air. A chaotic battle. In less than 10 breaths of time, many people drew their swords and attacked. However, there were also some that still restrained the displeasure and rage in their hearts, and they maintained their calm as they retreated successively and didn't get swept into the chaotic battle. It was obvious that the situation in front of them was what the person who issued the challenge wanted to see. Let's go. Someone muttered to himself. Without hesitation, He withdrew and quickly went down the mountain. However, there were also some that did not leave. They only retreated to a certain distance and chose to observe. The person who issued the challenge was equivalent to the mastermind behind the scenes, the existence of the mastermind. Now it was clear that it was a conspiracy. Therefore, they chose to observe. The mastermind behind the scenes would appear sooner or later. Chunzong separated himself from the crowd and stood on one side to watch the chaotic battle while paying attention to all the movements around him. Immediately, from the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of some people quickly leaving and going down the mountain. He could not help but feel that these people would not be able to escape so easily. An invisible net had been unknowingly spread out. Now, it seemed that it was time to reel in the net. Then, the people in the net were like fish. Should I catch them all in one fell swoop, or fight to the death? Or should I be swallowed by the fish? Chunzong muttered to himself. His voice was very soft, and only he could hear it. After someone killed one, he swept his gaze around, and his sword stirred up a storm, making an astonishing rumbling sound. It was as if all the wind aura between heaven and earth had gathered. Chunzong's eyes flashed, and he did not dodge. Instead, he unsheathed his sword and slashed through the air. Some people quickly flew down the mountain. They were dozens of meters away from each other. They did not fight, but were on guard against each other. The aura here was very oppressive, which made them instinctively feel uncomfortable. It was best to escape as soon as possible. Otherwise, the sword seals that they had obtained with great difficulty might become the possession of others. As they flew down the mountain, they were somewhat surprised and doubtful, because the sword seals sensed that there were 3 sword seals at the foot of the mountain, motionless. Were they people who had just come from afar? Or, with some doubts, these people also flew to the foot of the mountain. Immediately, their complexions changed. They only felt that the aura here was increasingly oppressive and filled with a sense of desolation. The desolation and murderous aura joined together, like an invisible net covering the sky and the sun. Even the light in the air was affected and became dim. Vaguely, there was a trace of blood smell in the air. Unconsciously, it flowed into the nose along with the air, making people feel even more uncomfortable. In front of them stood 3 figures. On the left was a masked man in black clothes. On the right was a tall young man in blood-red armor. As for the person in the middle, he was in a light golden armor with dragon-shaped sword patterns. It looked low-key and luxurious. It was obvious that the person in the middle was the leader of the 3. The 3 people were staring at each other with different gazes. Kill. Although they felt the oppressive aura in the air, the people who went down the mountain immediately rushed forward. They unsheathed their swords and directly attacked the 3 people. Instinctively, they felt that these 3 people had bad intentions. Then they killed them. But there were also some people who took the opportunity to quickly escape and rush to the side. Those who were able to enter this world through the sword garden competition were not weak. Each of them had excellent swordsmanship and were powerful. These 5 people instantly attacked. They did not deliberately join hands, but invisibly they formed a joint force. Your courage is commendable. The young man in heavy armor unsheathed his sword and grinned. There was a sense of bloodthirstiness in the air. The masked man in black clothes, shot out a ray of cold light from his eyes. As his killing intent flashed, his sword was half unsheathed and released a ray of black light. The young man in heavy armor and the masked man each blocked one person. The remaining 3 people all attacked the young man in luxurious light armor in the middle. Looking at the 3 people with swords, the young man who looked like a member of the royal family did not have the slightest fear. Instead, he revealed a smile, but that smile seemed to have a hint of bloodthirstiness. His right hand clasped the hilt of his sword, and the sword was unsheathed at the same speed. A slight friction sound was heard and filled the air. The moment the tip of the sword completely left the sheath, the speed of the sword suddenly increased by dozens of times. With a touch of light that was difficult to look at directly, it turned into a faint flowing light and broke through the air. It immediately penetrated the body of one of the people who was 10 meters away and then dissipated. "You are too weak." Like a soft sigh, the sound blended into the wind and passed into the ears of the other two people. They did not know why, but a sense of horror rose from the bottom of their hearts. A terrifying sharpness burst out in an instant, covering the sky and the earth, as if it had turned into a domain that covered the surroundings. Suppressed by this aura, the two people only felt their bodies sink. Their hands and feet felt stiff and weak, as if their strength was restricted and could not be fully released. Although it was only a breath's time, it was enough. The sword light flashed in front of them. When they wanted to react, they were one step too late. Pierced through, they were pierced through again and died directly. As for the other two battles not far away, they also ended at the same time. The 5 sword mark imprints were all dead, and their sword marks were all absorbed by the 3 people. "Your Highness, the chaotic battle on the mountain has already begun." The heavily armored youth shook off the blood on his sword and smiled. "Well, in a while, it will be time of harvest." The youth who was called Your Highness seemed to be a member of the royal family, with a faint smile. His expression was light, as if everything was in his hands. Halfway up the supporting sword mountain, the chaotic battle continued and became more and more intense. The sword technique drew the aura of the power of heaven and earth, fluctuating endlessly. Sometimes it was like a torrent, sometimes it was like a landslide, sometimes it was like a storm, and sometimes it was like a violent thunder. Chunzong killed the attacker with 3 swords. After obtaining more than a dozen sword marks, he retreated again and widened the distance between them. Under the same strength of body, but the difference in the level of sword technique led to the difference in strength, and it was even very obvious. "Die under my sword." The strength of Sword Ghost, who was wearing a ghost mask, was extremely tyrannical. Each of his swords burst out with extremely terrifying power. Dark shadows swept across, and ghost chi shrouded in all directions. On the other side, a bare-chested youth with a long robe tied around his waist like a skirt. His muscles were bulging, and he was full of amazing power. He held a sword with both hands and slashed repeatedly. Each of his swords was extremely violent, as if he could break the mountain and cut the heaven and earth. He was full of arrogance. There was another person with a sword in his hand. Bursts of dazzling light swept in all directions, as if a great light was shining and cleansing everything in the world. But under the brilliance of his sword, there was a trace of darkness. Where there was light, there would be darkness. Light was never alone, but accompanied by darkness. Chunzong could not help but squint his eyes. The combination of the sword of the light path and the dark path. Light and darkness were opposites. The combination of the two was more powerful than the combination of wind and thunder. However, although these 3 people had attracted Chunzong's attention, there was still one person who attracted the most attention from Chunzong. Chapter 2041. Second update. I was being naughty and forgot to update. Sometimes, the more inconspicuous a person was, the more terrifying they were. However, it seemed that only Chunzong noticed this person. Everyone else subconsciously ignored him. This was because up until now, this person had only defended and dodged. He hadn't killed anyone. It wasn't that he didn't have the ability to kill, but for some reason, he didn't kill anyone. As if sensing Chunzong's gaze, this person looked over. His eyes met with Chunzong's in an instant. A faint smile appeared on his face as he greeted Chunzong. A gust of wind swept up, and sword chi pierced through the air. It was the Fengling sect's eldest senior brother. Back in the Dongting Sword Garden, he had the idea of fighting Chunzong. Now it could be realized. Under his sword, the sword of the Way of Wind took on another form. It was as if he had turned into the wind. There was a gentle breeze, a cool breeze, a strong gale, a fierce gale, and a hurricane. Everything was contained within it. Endless sword chi of wind filled the area. It was extremely violent. Vaguely, in the wind tornado, there were even strands of electric light. It was like cold lightning crisscrossing, filling the air with astonishing power. It wasn't the power of the Sword of Thunderway. It had nothing to do with the Sword of Thunder way. It was the power of thunder that was born after the Sword of Wind way was pushed to the extreme. To a certain extent, wind could generate electricity. In fact, it wasn't just wind. When fire reached a certain mysterious extreme, it could also generate the power of thunder and lightning. Of course, knowing was one thing, but whether or not it could be done was another. Obviously, the Fonling sect's eldest senior brother was very talented and capable in this Tao. The Sword of Wind way's mutation was pushed to the extreme. It derived new mysteries and generated the power of thunder and lightning, making the Sword of Wind way even more powerful. Chunzong stood still. As he waved his sword, he blocked the sword chi of Wind way that contained the power of thunder and lightning. He carefully felt the mysteries within. There were thousands of sword ways, and there was no end to them. Even if it was a sword technique, under the sword of different sword cultivators, there would be different mysteries. It was impossible for him to fully comprehend all the profundities of the sword Tao by himself. However, if he could rely on the profundities of others to comprehend himself, then he might be able to accomplish it. An indescribable feeling surged in his heart. The thought flashed through his mind in an instant. If it had been in the Dongting Sword Garden, the Fonling sect's eldest senior brother would have been able to fight him, and the outcome would have been hard to predict. But now, even though the Fonling sect's eldest senior brother's strength had improved a lot, he was no longer a strong opponent for Chunzong. Chunzong cultivated wholeheartedly with the help of his superior power of understanding and the abundant supply of profound chi pills and spirit-nourishing pills. His swordsmanship had improved by leaps and bounds, and he had improved a lot compared to when he had just entered the supporting sword kingdom. After the fight with the Fonling sect's eldest senior brother, Chunzong had figured out his strength, so he attacked with his sword. That sword strike was misty like a dream. It caused eldest senior brother of the Wind Spirit sect to pause for a moment. Confusion appeared in his eyes, as if he had entered an illusion. Even though it was only for a moment, it was enough. Kill. More than 20 sword seals flew into the back of Chunzong's left hand, increasing the number of sword seals that Chunzong had. Die, you ant. Jian Kuang held his sword with both hands and slashed down. It was as if a slash could split the heavens and the earth. That was the terrifying power of the Sword of Tao Obliteration. It was extremely tyrannical. The young marshal of the Heavenly Punishment Army couldn't help but tremble under that slash. He felt as if he was about to be destroyed. Too strong. Jian Kuang's strength was really too terrifying. Clearly, his body was of the same strength, but the power that erupted from that slash was extremely terrifying. It was as if it had exploded several times more. Jian Kuang had obviously mastered some kind of technique that could instantly explode his body's strength. Moreover, it didn't seem to put too much of a burden on his body. Such a technique might not be considered brilliant when his cultivation was restored, but it was extremely shocking in the current situation. I can't block it. The young marshal of the Heavenly Punishment Army couldn't block it at all. He was directly slashed in the leg. The web between his thumb and index finger that was holding the sword split open, dripping with blood. He couldn't help but retreat. Every step he took seemed to crush the ground. He quickly mobilized his strength and was about to use the profound meaning of the Sword of Tao Obliteration to counterattack. However, a violent sword light appeared in front of him again. If he couldn't block it, he would die. The more intense the battle, the more people died and the fewer people survived. In the end, only a few people survived. They were the victors. The sword demon with the devil mask. The sword maniac with an overbearing aura. The sword demon with a baleful aura. The sword demon with a seductive appearance and a strange aura. The seemingly unremarkable young man who didn't kill anyone. And the unfathomable Chunzong with an introverted aura. 6 people. The sword maniac, the sword demon, the young man with a very low presence, and Chunzong were men. The sword demon was a woman. As for the sword demon, he was wearing a mask, so it was impossible to tell whether he was a man or a woman. The sword demon stood still with an eerie aura. His whole body seemed to be floating, which was very strange. The sword maniac's eyes, which were full of fighting spirit, glanced at each person's face and paused for a moment. It was as if each of them was a target to be killed. The sword demon's eyes glowed with a scarlet light. Endless killing intent flowed in his eyes, as if it would explode at any time. The sword demon's seductive face had a smile. She looked even more seductive and seductive, but she also gave people a feeling of extreme danger. On the other hand, the young man who had not killed a single person and had a very low presence had a faint smile on his face. Chunzong's expression was indifferent and his aura was completely restrained. However, he gave off an unfathomable feeling. At this point, the person behind the scenes should be appearing soon. Not long after, light footsteps were heard. Someone was going up the mountain. Going up the mountain at this time aroused more thoughts in people's minds. They glanced around and looked in the direction of the footsteps. First, two figures appeared. One was wearing heavy armor with a short red cloak on his back, while the other was wearing a black mask. Then, the third person appeared. The young man, who was wearing a low-key and luxurious light armor with dragon-shaped sword patterns, looked like a noble. His face was indifferent, as if he was smiling, but also as if he wasn't. His eyes were covered with a faint luster, with a kind of arrogance that looked down on the world. That trace of arrogance was not deliberately revealed. It was a kind of temperament that came from the depths of his bones and soul. It could be concluded that this person's identity in the outside world must be very extraordinary. At that moment, Chunzong caught a glimpse of a young man with a very low presence. His pupils shrank in an instant, although it was very subtle. It seemed that he knew this person, or rather, he knew this person's identity. Are you the ones who issued the challenge? The sword maniac grinned. With a shake of his long sword, the sword chi swept across the sky, pointing directly at the three people who were walking over. Then let's fight. As soon as the sword maniac's voice fell, the muscles in his legs bulged and contracted in an instant, bursting out in extremely tyrannical force. With a boom, his whole body rushed out like a meteorite. He raised his sword and slashed down fiercely. The sword momentum was filled with an astonishing destructive aura. It was extremely violent, as if it could cut through everything. It was extremely terrifying. What came head-on was an extremely violent sword pressure. Under the slash of the sword, a long sword mark was left on the ground, which quickly spread forward. Chunzong stared, and his pupils shrank slightly. He was secretly surprised by the other party's method of supernatural power. It was very terrifying. It was more thorough and more extreme, and it would also put a greater burden on the body. The extremely violent sword slashed mercilessly at the young man, who looked like a member of the royal family. However, the young man's expression did not change at all. It seemed that he had no intention of dodging, nor did he draw his sword to counter. Good timing. The young man, wearing heavy armor and short cloak on the side, suddenly roared and took a step forward. The moment his foot landed, it seemed that the ground was trampled and countless cracks appeared around him. With a boom, his whole body rushed forward. Unlike the sword maniac, his feet were constantly stepping on the ground, and he directly rushed out 3 steps. His sword was unsheathed, and in an instant, it brought about an extremely violent force. It swept up a gathering of starlight and blasted out like a meteorite breaking through the sky. Sword of Starry Path. This was a sword technique that emphasized strength. It mobilized all the strength in one's body to suppress the opponent with strength. When the two collided head-on, their bodies trembled slightly. The sword maniac's body rushed up into the sky, while the heavily armored young man's body sank down. The ground under his feet was even more thoroughly shattered. A violent sound suddenly exploded, and layers of sound waves rolled and raged. Endless sword chi tore in all directions, as if it was going to shatter everything. It was extremely terrifying. Good. The sword maniac was very excited because this person had actually blocked his full-strength sword slash. Good opponent. The more excited the sword maniac was, the more his strength surged. His sword slashed down again, and it seemed to be even more violent. The heavily armored young man looked dignified. The strength of the opponent's sword was so strong that it shocked him. The second sword slashed down, and it seemed to be even stronger and more terrifying. However, the heavily armored young man was not afraid at all. Instead, he gathered all the strength in his body, and with a stomp of his feet, his strength exploded, and his sword swept up. Let's play too. The sword demon's glowing red eyes flashed. He suddenly drew his sword, condensed an extremely shocking killing intent, and directly attacked the royal young man. You are not qualified to fight with His Highness. As the masked man spoke, his body flashed, and his sword brought out a hazy black light, instantly attacking the sword demon. Now, no one will stop me. The sword demon's voice was a little erratic, with a slight accent, and no one could tell if it was a man or a woman. As the voice fell, the sword demon's body flashed, as if he was weightless. He floated forward with a light breeze, and his sword was unsheathed in an instant, silently stabbing out. The royal young man revealed a smile, and that trace of arrogance became more obvious. At the same time, he opened his mouth, and his voice was slightly magnetic, as if it could capture everyone's attention. You must be very curious as to why His Highness issued a challenge to you. As his voice fell, his right hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and with a rhythm, his 5 fingers clasped together, slowly unsheathing the sword at an even speed. The moment the tip of the sword left the scabbard, the sword demon's sword happened to be within 3 meters of him. His Highness has planned everything from the moment we entered this place. The sword was drawn. A faint sword light left, piercing through the void, and disappeared in a flash. Chapter 2042. Third update. The ghastly sword slashed out in an instant, but the young man who looked like a member of the royal family did not move at all. He swung his sword and blocked Sword Demon's sword aura like a seal. I'm the Crown Prince of Suppressing Sword Kingdom. I have all the power. Everything about you is under my control. The young man kept talking as he waved his sword. His voice was neither loud nor soft, as if he was enjoying the process. It was as if he was a god who had everything under his control. Now that he was talking, he felt a great sense of satisfaction from the bottom of his heart. This was his hobby, controlling everything and then saying it out loud, so that the other party would be shocked, furious, and powerless to resist. There was nothing more fascinating than this. The Crown Prince of Suppressing Sword Ghost's sword moved in a natural way with an indescribable mystery. Sword Ghost's hair stood on end, and he quickly retreated. I don't need to run around. I just need to gather you here with a letter of challenge at the right time and let you fight with each other. Then I'll kill the few winners. Everything will belong to me. Don't even think about running away. The foot of Suppressing Sword Mountain is already filled with the most elite troops of Suppressing Sword Kingdom. No one can escape. Come on, I'm right here. Either you're killed by me and all the sword seals will belong to me, and the sword son of Dongting will be mine. Or you can kill me. There was an indescribable fanaticism in his voice when he said the last sentence. It was obvious that although Sword Ghost was powerful, he was still no match for this man. He was already at a disadvantage and was in danger. In an instant, Sword Ghost twisted his body and stirred up a seductive wind. His sword radiance shot out. Sword Ghost's swordsmanship was strange and unpredictable. His sword seemed to go up, but it could also go down or behind. It was a very strange swordsmanship that was impossible to guard against. In the other 2 places, Sword Kwong was suppressing the young man in heavy armor. Sword Demon was fighting with the masked man. There were only 2 people who hadn't made a move yet. One of them was a young man with a low sense of presence, and the other was the mysterious Chunzong. Chunzong was watching. The Sword Demon and the Sword Ghost were indeed more powerful when they worked together. However, the Crown Prince didn't seem to be at a disadvantage at all. With the sword in hand, all of the attacks from the Sword Demon and Sword Demon were blocked, unable to harm him at all. Is this all you've got? The Crown Prince of Supporting Sword Country asked again. His voice was light, but there was a hint of disdain in it. It was a contempt that came from the bottom of his heart. You guys are only at this level. How disdainful. In an instant, anger rose from Sword Demon and Sword Devil's hearts, and their attacks became even more ferocious. Although I don't like to fight with numbers, sometimes I have to. The young man who had been standing at the side all this while spoke as he stepped forward. At the same time, his right hand landed on the hilt of the sword. He exerted a little force with his 5 fingers and clasped the hilt. His footsteps grew faster and faster, and eventually he turned into a blur as he closed in on Zhang Xian. He unsheathed his sword and shot out with an undetectable sword light. That sword light had a kind of misty and subtle color, which made people subconsciously ignore it. The sword of illusion. This person cultivated the sword of illusion, and he had developed it to another level. It was different from Chunzong's sword of illusion. The crown prince of supporting sword country was indeed deceived by the sword. He was almost stabbed, but he managed to dodge it at the critical moment. "Who are you?" the crown prince asked as he dodged the sword and counterattacked. "Gu Jianchen." The young man, with a low sense of presence, replied calmly. He attacked again with the second sword. He had a very good grasp of the timing. This time, his sword was embedded in the middle of the sword demon and sword ghost attacks, making it harder for people to detect and defend against. Dustless sword, Gu Jianchen. So it's you. The crown prince of supporting sword country seemed to know Gu Jianchen. You should know me, right? The crown prince of underworld Luo Empire. I've heard of you for a long time. Gu Jianchen replied as he attacked mercilessly. Chunzong paid attention to everyone's sword techniques, reflecting and verifying them with his own sword techniques. He was in a special state, and countless ideas kept surging in his mind. They kept on colliding, stirring up even more sparks of inspiration. Chunzong also heard what the crown prince said, but he didn't care. Compared to his comprehension of the way of the sword, it didn't seem important at all. Chunzong gained something new every moment. The sword of wind, the sword of thunder, the sword of fire, the sword of metal, the sword of destruction, the sword of killing, the sword of illusion. All kinds of inspirations appear like a fountain. Countless sword lights flickered in the depths of Chunzong's eyes, reverberating endlessly. The heavily armored young man was completely suppressed by the sword maniac. The terrifying explosive power was unleashed without any pause. It was so violent that the heavily armored young man could only raise his sword to defend himself. The battle between the sword demon and a masked man gradually came to a conclusion. The masked man was indeed very powerful. His figure was fleeting, but the masked man gradually paled in comparison to the sword demon's murderous sword. It seemed like it was only a matter of time before the victor was decided. However, the sword demon, sword ghost, and Gu Jianchen still couldn't defeat the crown prince of underworld Luo Empire. However, the addition of Gu Jianchen seemed to have a synergistic effect. The three of them worked together even more closely. It was as if they had turned into an inescapable net that completely enveloped the crown prince of underworld Luo Empire. You all have the right to make me use my true strength. The crown prince of underworld Luo Empire's words shocked everyone. Was he still using his true strength at this level? If he was using his true strength, how terrifying would he be? In an instant, the crown prince of underworld Luo Empire's eyes narrowed. Traces of an extremely mysterious aura spread out from his body. The mysterious aura was suffused with traces of sharpness. It enveloped the surroundings as if it had turned into a force field. It also seemed like it was about to condense into a domain. Chunzong was shocked. This aura and fluctuation was very familiar. It was clearly a fluctuation that only appeared at the 6th level of the Way of the Sword. It turned out that other than him, there were others who had touched the 6th level of the Way of the Sword when they were below the Ascension Realm. I'm not alone. An indescribable joy surged from the depths of Chunzong's heart and filled his heart. Chunzong had long felt that with the vastness of the void and the innumerable cultivators, there would definitely be some geniuses who weren't inferior to him or even surpassed him. There was no doubt about this. But thinking about it was just thinking about it. He had yet to see it, or come into contact with it. He didn't expect to have the chance to see them this time. Gu Jianshun, Sword Demon, and Sword Demon's expressions changed slightly. They all felt a mysterious change in each other's aura. Vaguely, there was a feeling that everything was being seen through. Control. A feeling of controlling the surroundings spontaneously arose. It was a wonderful feeling, and also a feeling that the Crown Prince of Underworld Luo liked the most. Everything within a radius of a few meters was under his control. He struck out with his sword and immediately blocked the three's attacks. The sword followed an incomparably mysterious trajectory and counterattacked. The profundity of this sword was indescribable. Chunzong was the only one who understood what it was. Chunzong realized that in terms of the first level of the Way of the Sword, he was similar to the Crown Prince of Underworld Luo Empire. Both of them had just touched the surface, but the Crown Prince of Underworld Luo Empire's application was clearly more refined. What Chunzong didn't know was that the Underworld Luo Empire, where the Crown Prince of Underworld Luo came from, was a star sector level force. It was very powerful and ruled over several star sectors. Although it lacked Dominator-level experts, it had a deep foundation and many experts. Among them, there were some experts who had grasped the sixth level of the Way of the Sword. As the Crown Prince of the Underworld Luo Empire, it was equivalent to being the successor of the Emperor of the Underworld Luo Empire. Naturally, he would enjoy countless resources and benefits. It was normal for him to be taught by experts. Although it was the power of the imminent realm, and it was unpredictable for those below the imminent realm, those powerful and ancient forces would always have some ways to guide the other party without letting them know the details of the imminent realm. On the other hand, Chunzong was much worse in this aspect. Although Chunzong had entered the Eternal Battle Fort, he was only at the fighter level, the lowest level. Just like the matriculation camp level, he had attracted some attention from the Eternal Battle Fort because of his talent. However, it was only some attention. After all, Chunzong was only at the initial stage when he was in the Eternal Battle Fort, and he wasn't at his current stage of growth. Speaking of which, it had been a while since he went to the Eternal Battle Fort because he hadn't found a suitable opportunity. As for the Heavenly Palace of Will, Chunzong had indeed obtained part of its inheritance. It was certain that he was related to the Heavenly Palace of Will, but he hadn't reached the level of being a member of the Heavenly Palace of Will. After all, Chunzong had never been to the Heavenly Palace of Will, nor had he entered the Heavenly Palace of Will. So what could he do? He could only rely on his own efforts. With his own ability, talent, and hard work, he could catch up with and surpass those geniuses who were heavily nurtured by the major forces. What was commendable was that his learning ability was very strong. It was all thanks to his powerful soul and extraordinary perception. Chunzong kept absorbing the Crown Prince's application of the sixth level of the Way of the Sword. He kept learning and verifying it with himself, improving himself imperceptibly. Under the high level of the Way of the Sword, Gu Jianshun, Sword Demon, and Sword Demon's cooperation was broken. It's time to reap. The Crown Prince's voice rang out and entered the three's ears. Suddenly, an indescribable horror struck the deepest part of their hearts, making their hair stand on end. There seemed to be a flash of sword light in front of their eyes, as if it was jumping in the void. It also seemed like a falling star, carrying a terrifying power that could destroy everything. However, there was also a misty feeling like a dream, making it impossible to tell what was real and what was not. Kill. Chapter 2043. Sword Demon, dead. Sword Demon, dead. Gu Jianshun, dead. Streaks of sword seals glowed with flowing light and rapidly merged into the back of Ming Luo Crown Prince's left hand. Originally, Ming Luo Crown Prince only had one sword seal, the one that belonged to him. Now, the number of sword seals increased rapidly, close to 600. This made Ming Luo Crown Prince reveal a smile. The harvest was indeed great. Although there were still a few days left before the month, it was impossible for anyone to surpass him in sword seals in such a short period of time. Moreover, there were other people present. At the same time, the heavily armored youth could not withstand Jian Kuang's violent slash. His long sword was slashed away, and another slash landed, killing him. With the sword seal in hand, Jian Kuang's battle intent soared to the sky. With a stomp of his feet, his strength erupted again. Like a fierce tiger descending from the mountain, he held the sword with both hands and slashed heavily at Ming Luo Crown Prince. However, when the sword slashed down, it suddenly became sluggish, as if it had fallen into a heavy stream of water. It was constantly pulled, and the speed of the sword slowed down and even deviated to the side. The veins on Jian Kuang's arms bulged, and his muscles swelled. He clenched his teeth, and the veins on his forehead bulged, as if they were about to explode. His strength was constantly erupting. Without a doubt, this was a terrifying strength and a terrifying slash. But even so, it was unable to reverse the deviation and slowed down of the sword. Ming Luo Crown Prince also swung his sword and slashed. Jian Kuang was dead. The berserk sword demon also beheaded the masked man. After obtaining his sword seal, he waved his long sword and rolled up an extremely terrifying pitch-black sword chi. It was like a destructive storm that swept towards the underworld crown prince. The demonic sword chi slaughtered in all directions. Ming Luo Crown Prince swung his sword. The sword light was like a meteor breaking the moon. The speed of the sword was shockingly fast, and it also carried the violent, destructive power of a falling meteor. This was the profound meaning of the Sword of Star Path. It was also integrated with the profound meaning of the Sword of Tao Obliteration. The tyrannical sword slashed out in an instant and immediately destroyed the demonic sword chi. It was heading towards Sword Demon. Ming Luo Crown Prince, who had unleashed his full strength, was too strong. Even Sword Demon was not his opponent. You're the only one left. Why aren't you drawing your sword? Ming Luo Crown Prince's gaze swept past as he stared at Yi Qingyu. He opened his mouth and smiled. His gaze and demeanor clearly had a feeling that everything was under his control. The others were all dead, leaving only Ming Luo Crown Prince and Qinzong. Ming Luo Crown Prince's words were naturally directed at Qinzong. Or do you plan to surrender? I don't accept surrendering soldiers. You misunderstood. I just feel very happy. Qinzong smiled. The 5 fingers of his right hand wriggled gently. Waves of battle intent surged from the depths of his heart. The distance of each step was 1 meter, and the length was the same as if it had been carefully measured. Even the speed was the same as if it had been practiced thousands of times. With every step he took, Qinzong's aura became more condensed. Happy? Are you happy that you can fight me one-on-one? Ming Luo Crown Prince squinted his eyes and stared at Qinzong. Since that's the case, I'll give you a chance. As long as you can take 3 of my swords, I'll give you a chance to follow me. Remember, I'm the current Crown Prince of Ming Luo Empire in Ming Luo Starfield. Ming Luo Crown Prince swung his sword as he finished his words. Sword Chi pierced through the air. This sword merged the mysteries of the Sword of Wind Tao, Sword of Water Tao, and Sword of Metal Tao. Not only was it fast, but it was also extremely sharp and subtle. At the same time, Qinzong's right hand brought along layers of afterimages as he placed it on the sword hilt. He clasped his fingers and unsheathed the sword. The sword shot out like a flowing light. The sword light was like a crescent moon cutting through the void. It was filled with the aura of the Sword of Metal Tao, Sword of Wind Tao, and Sword of Thunder Tao. It was also the fusion of the 3 swords. This was not a difficult task for Qinzong. The sword chi and the sword light collided and instantly exploded. Ming Luo Crown Prince's eyes lit up slightly. He did not take any stance, but his figure flew forward. It was as if he was one with the sword. It was like a starlight piercing through the air. A faintly discernible aura of destruction condensed under the sword. The Sword of Star Tao and the Sword of Destruction. This sword was the one that killed Sword Devil directly. Its power was extremely tyrannical. It was even more powerful than the fusion of the 3 swords. Qinzong also swung his sword. This time, it was the fusion of the sword of killing Tao and the sword of destruction. The sword light collided once again and instantly exploded. Before Ming Luo Crown Prince swung his sword, Chunzong swung his sword for the third time. When he swung his sword, Chunzong's right foot twisted and turned on the ground, causing the ground to crumble in an instant. An extremely powerful force suddenly went from the sole of his foot to his thigh, through his waist. It condensed his strength from the bottom to the top, and then rushed through his shoulder into his right arm that was holding the sword. Burst! This was the result of Chunzong observing Sword Maniac's violent force. He constantly simulated and improved it, making it a force technique that was suitable for his body. Chunzong knew that this kind of violent technique, despite being able to explode with an even more shocking force, would cause quite a lot of injuries to the body. However, this kind of injury was like an internal injury. It would lurk in the body until it accumulated to a certain extent, then it would explode and directly cause damage to the body. Chunzong guessed that Sword Maniac dared to explode so unscrupulously because this kind of technique could accumulate a lot of internal injuries. Moreover, once he left this world, the so-called internal injuries would be nothing to his body after his cultivation recovered. It would not affect him at all. After all, this kind of explosive technique was only targeted at this level of body. This was something that Chunzong could be sure of. Since that was the case, he could also use it. Facing Chunzong's sword, Ming Luo Crown Prince's face suddenly tensed up. He was somewhat solemn as he felt threatened. The sixth level of sword principle, that feeling of being in control of the area, appeared once again. When Chunzong's sword slashed into the area, he immediately felt as if there were countless invisible forces falling on the sword, constantly blocking the slashing sword and constantly pulling it, wanting to deviate the sword to one side. Then, since you have this level, I have also mastered it. Without hesitation, Chunzong also displayed the sixth level of sword principle. Although it was superficial, it could bring about a qualitative improvement. The power at the level of imminent God, even if it was just a trace, was enough to significantly enhance the strength of a demigod. That was a kind of huge gap, a gap that belonged to a completely different level. Ming Luo Crown Prince suddenly widened his eyes. His face was full of astonishment. The sixth level of sword principle. This person, like him, had also mastered the sixth level of sword principle. Unbelievable. Which star field are you from? Ming Luo Crown Prince couldn't help but ask. A rogue cultivator. Chunzong's answer made Ming Luo Crown Prince's eyes widen. Up until now, Chunzong's identity was still a rogue cultivator. Under the control of the sixth level of sword principle, both sides canceled each other out. The slashing sword returned to its original state, as if it was going to cut Ming Luo Crown Prince in half. Ming Luo Crown Prince couldn't dodge in time, so he waved his sword and the sword light raged. Ming Luo Crown Prince couldn't help but tremble and took 2 steps back to dissipate the power. His opponent had also mastered the sixth level of sword principle and was not inferior to him, which was equivalent to removing one of his advantages. Then, he could only rely on his sword skills to determine the level. In an instant, the sword light burst out. Sword of metal principle, sword of wind principle, sword of water principle, sword of thunder principle, sword of star principle, sword of destruction, sword of killing principle. There were a total of 7. As for Chunzong's mastery of the 14 sword arts of Dong Ting, there were exactly 7 of them. Sword of metal principle, sword of wind principle, sword of fire principle, sword of thunder principle, sword of destruction, sword of killing principle, sword of illusion principle. Most of them were the same, only 2 were different. The 7 sword skills were performed to their heart's content under the swords of Ming Luo Crown Prince and Chunzong. When the 2 realized this, the shock in their hearts was indescribable. Chunzong was very excited. This was the feeling of meeting a worthy opponent, just like the feeling when he had the final battle with Heavenly God Gong. No, it was even more exciting than that time, because Heavenly God Gong was not a sword cultivator, but Ming Luo Crown Prince was. It was even more exciting to fight with a strong opponent who was also a sword cultivator, wasn't it? Compared to Qinzong, Ming Luo Crown Prince's heart was filled with anger and killing intent in addition to shock. How could there be someone who could be compared to him? If this person's background was better than his, then he would feel better in his heart. But this person said that he was a rogue cultivator. Although he didn't know whether it was true or not, there were two possibilities. One was that this person was indeed a rogue cultivator. How could a rogue cultivator be more talented than him? The other was that this person's background was very high, surpassing his own. But if he had such a high background, was there a need to participate in the assessment of the East Court Sword Mountain? If it wasn't for the fact that the Sword Dao of the East Court Sword Mountain was useful to him, with his identity and status, there was no need for him to participate in the assessment at all. As this thought flashed through his mind, Ming Luo Crown Prince's sword light became more and more explosive. Qinzong felt that Ming Luo Crown Prince's sword skills had signs of forming a unique lineage, indicating that his foundation and accumulation were very shocking. But Qinzong's accumulation was even more shocking, and coupled with the explosive skills that he learned from Sword Maniac, Ming Luo Crown Prince was actually faintly suppressed. Retreat. After Ming Luo Crown Prince took Qinzong's sword head-on, he used the force to retreat quickly and quickly adjusted his breathing. After a fierce battle, he felt that he had consumed a lot of his strength. Let's decide the winner with one sword. Ming Luo Crown Prince narrowed his eyes slightly. His voice became low, and his body slightly bent down in an instant. Okay. Qinzong was also very willing. Storing power. The two began to store power. Deciding the winner with one sword was the last sword, and also the strongest sword. Only the strongest sword, the sword that exhausted all of one's strength, had the qualification to decide the winner and the loser, life and death. This sword would be unreserved, and it was to disregard one's own life and death. Either you die or I die. There was no third possibility, and there was no luck to speak of. Adjust. Ming Luo Crown Prince constantly adjusted his breathing, adjusted his essence, qi, and spirit, mobilized all the remaining strength in his body, and completely condensed it into a highly condensed force. Around his body, a completely different aura emerged. Qinzong stood still. His essence, qi, and spirit were mobilized in an instant, completely fused together, carrying a different aura mystery, and poured into the sword in his hand. That move, his strongest move, was about to be unleashed at this very moment, erupting with unparalleled might. Chapter 2044. Second update. Remember to follow the public account. Six Dao sinks. Six Dao announces a big secret. At the foot of Suppressing Sword Mountain, there were many figures in black and red armor with long swords at their waists. Each of them had a cold expression and a murderous look in their eyes. Their whole body was filled with a terrifying aura. Sword cavalry, archer cavalry, sword and shield soldiers, strong sword soldiers, strong crossbow soldiers. These were the 5 major arms of the Suppressing Sword Country. Moreover, they were all elites. Each of them had undergone strict training and were able to cooperate with each other seamlessly. At a glance, there were tens of thousands of such soldiers. They surrounded Suppressing Sword Mountain and were ready to attack at any time. Their bodies were majestic and motionless. Their auras were connected together like an inescapable net that sealed off everything in the surroundings. It was as if the air had stopped flowing. There was not the slightest ripple. It was incomparably murderous, cold, and oppressive. Even a Sword Dao Grandmaster would not be able to hold on for long before being killed by such elite soldiers. Further away, there were hundreds of thousands of well-trained regular soldiers that were ready to reinforce at any time. As Ming Luo Crown Prince had said, an inescapable net had already been set up at the foot of Suppressing Sword Mountain. Even if someone wanted to leave Suppressing Sword Mountain alive, he or she would be surrounded by the army and killed. In such a world where one's strength was restricted, no one could be spared. Halfway up Suppressing Sword Mountain, Ming Luo Crown Prince and Shenzong were 10 meters apart from each other. They were constantly accumulating power. Gold, a deep and powerful voice sounded. In an instant, a trace of gold filled the air around Ming Luo, Crown Prince. It quickly condensed into a finger-sized sword aura. Wind. Immediately, the sword aura of wind also condensed, followed by the sword aura of water and then the sword aura of thunder. Specks of starlight filled the air as if they were projected from the void. At first, it was very subtle. Then, it became strong and turned into a sword aura of stars. Finally, it was the sword aura that emitted a terrifying aura of destruction. The sword aura of destruction. 6 streaks of sword chi with different colors and auras condensed around the underworld crown prince. Each of them exuded a terrifying power. These 6 sword auras had exhausted Ming Luo, Crown Prince's spirit. Have a taste of the power of my 6 ultimate reincarnation sword. As soon as the underworld crown prince's voice fell, his long sword vibrated and instantly swung out. In a split second, 6 rays of sword chi shot out. Shooting out sword chi was not difficult for the powerful sword chi in this world. It could be done by sword Dao grandmasters. However, it was impossible for sword Dao grandmasters to do such high-intensity and condensed sword chi. It was unknown whether sword Dao grandmasters could do it. Moreover, directly condensing 6 such pure and terrifying strands of sword chi was incomparably difficult, because every single strand of sword chi was condensed with all one strength. They were all condensed with the essence of profundities. The difficulty of controlling 6 strands of sword chi at the same time was not just 6 times, but more than 10 times. 6 streaks of sword chi pierced through the air at an astonishing speed. They spun rapidly, as if they had turned into a wheel, and charged toward Shenzong with terrifying power. The 6 rotating sword chis quickly converged towards the center. Using the high-speed rotation as a guide, the 6 sword chis gathered together to form the most powerful attack. At the same time, Shenzong poured all of his strength into the long sword in his hand. A gust of wind blew and turned into sword chi, pouring into the long sword in his hand. Sword of wind Dao, sword of thunder Dao, sword of fire Dao, sword of metal Dao, sword of destruction Dao, sword of killing Dao. Finally, it was the sword of illusion Dao. Shenzong's right arm that was holding the sword was constantly trembling. The long sword was also constantly vibrating, as if it would break at any time because it could not withstand the powerful force. However, the material of the long sword was indeed amazing. Although it did not have any special power, it was very tough. Tendons and veins bulged on Shenzong's arm. His eyes were glaring angrily, and the terrifying radiance was like a heavenly sword piercing through the air. He stomped his feet, and the soles of his front feet suddenly sank and spun on the ground. The combat shoes under his feet also cracked in an instant. His body moved slightly like a dragon swaying. An extremely powerful force completely erupted from his feet, through his waist, through his right arm, and rushed to the sword body, reaching the tip of the sword. Essence, chi, and spirit. The profound power of the 7 sword techniques. The power of the sword maniac's technique. Everything was integrated into this sword, and nothing was held back. This was because this sword would determine victory and defeat, life and death. There was no luck. If he did not give it his all, it was very likely that he would be killed by his opponent, and everything would be in vain. Even if he was lucky in the remaining few days and could obtain many more sword seals, it would definitely not be comparable to this. Therefore, he had to win this battle. He had to give it his all. The sword trembled violently, as if it was about to leave his hand. Shenzong felt that the web between his thumb and forefinger was cracked. He stabbed out with the sword. With a boom, it was as if the earth was falling apart. The bones in his arm instantly made a series of explosive sounds. His tendons and veins were constantly being pulled, and there was a burst of pain. It was very uncomfortable. Obviously, his major tendons were damaged, but Shenzong did not seem to notice it and still stabbed out with the sword. Great destruction. This sword was called Great Destruction. It was a sword that Chunzong had integrated the profound of the 7 sword techniques into one. It was a sword that gave it his all. In an instant, a dark crack appeared in the void under the sword. The crack quickly spread and connected into a large area. That was the aura of darkness, the aura of emptiness, and the aura of destruction. It directly descended. Ming Luo Crown Prince's expression suddenly changed. He only felt that the darkness was absolute, as if it could devour everything and destroy everything. He felt as if the sky had collapsed, and the mountains under his feet had also collapsed in an instant. This was caused by the integration of the sword intent of the illusion Tao. It directly impacted one's mind and made one feel as if it was really destroyed. The sword chi of the 6 ultimate reincarnation sword gathered into one and attacked. Chunzong's Great Destruction also attacked. When the sword chi collided, it instantly sank into the darkness, and there were continuous bursts of terrifying sounds and explosions. One had to admit that the power of the 6 ultimate reincarnation sword was indeed very terrifying. If he had not comprehended such a unique skill like Great Destruction, he was afraid that he would not be able to resist and would be killed directly. But now it was different. A sword light suddenly shot out from the darkness of Great Destruction. It was as swift and violent as wind, as sharp as gold, as destructive as annihilation, as murderous as condensed murderous intent. After Ming Luo Crown Prince displayed the 6 ultimate reincarnation sword, he was already powerless to attack again. Even dodging had become very difficult. There was no way he could avoid Chunzong's sword. Tens of thousands of elite soldiers are at the foot of the mountain. Even if you kill me, you will not be able to leave here. Ming Luo Crown Prince revealed a smile. At the same time, he crushed the ball that had appeared in his left hand out of nowhere. When Chunzong's sword arrived and pierced through Ming Luo Crown Prince's forehead, the broken ball also directly soared into the sky and exploded in the sky. With a loud boom, the momentum was astonishing. It was like a grand firework that exploded like a giant sword across the sky. Looking at the giant sword-shaped firework, a strong sense of uneasiness and crisis suddenly emerged from the deepest part of his heart. It was as swift as thunder and instantly swept through his whole body. Without any hesitation, Chunzong immediately crushed the profound chi pill and vitality pill that he had already put in his mouth. He quickly swallowed them to replenish his consumption, make up for the deficit in his body, and at the same time heal the injury on his right hand. The profound chi pill could not only replenish the consumption of the body, but to a certain extent, it could also relieve the injury and slowly heal the injury. Of course, if it was an external injury, the profound chi pill would be useless. With the replenishment of the energy essence pill and the spirit nourishing pill, Chunzong felt that some of the emptiness in his body had been replenished. He felt much better, but he still hadn't recovered. After all, using the move Great Destruction was equivalent to hollowing out his body. It wouldn't be easy to recover. Without hesitation, Chunzong took out another profound chi pill and vitality pill and consumed it. Fortunately, he had prepared a lot of profound chi pills and vitality pills before coming. Otherwise, it would be troublesome. Hundreds of sword seals flew up and sank into the back of his left hand. There were too many sword seals in a short period of time, making Chunzong feel a constant tingling and burning sensation on the back of his left hand. These sword seals came from Sword Ghost, Sword Demon, Sword Maniac, Sword Demon, and that person called Gu Jianshin. As for the Underworld Crown Prince and the other 2, they only had 1 sword seal each. They had been assigned a very good position from the beginning and had made a good plan to harvest everything now. Who would have thought that in the end, they would all belong to Chunzong? With 2 profound chi pills and 2 vitality pills, Chunzong's deficit was quickly replenished. Although he had not fully recovered, it did not hinder his normal movement. When Chunzong was about to step down the mountain, a strong palpitation suddenly rose up in his heart. Without any hesitation, Chunzong quickly rushed up the mountain. At the same time, the tens of thousands of elite troops around Sword Suppressing Mountain changed their eyes after seeing the huge sword fireworks. They became sharp and full of killing intent and immediately moved to climb the mountain. This was the reason why the Underworld Crown Prince said that even if Chunzong killed him, he would not be able to leave here. It was impossible for Chunzong alone to kill his way out of the tens of thousands of elite troops, not to mention that there were also hundreds of thousands of regular troops. Going down the mountain was just courting death, but it was impossible to stay in the same place, as it would also be dangerous. The only way out was to climb the mountain. Now that he was only halfway up the mountain, he would climb the mountain and deal with the enemy in this mountain until the time was up. There were only a few days left. Soon, with an incomparably firm mind, Chunzong began to climb the mountain. His speed was not very fast, but it was not slow either. While climbing the mountain, Chunzong looked back and pondered. Counting the profound chi pills and vitality pills he obtained from the crowd, plus the ones he originally carried, he had 18 profound chi pills. The vitality pills were less, but there were still 10 of them. If he used them properly, he should be able to get through these few days. While climbing the mountain, Chunzong also looked for a favorable terrain. At the foot of the mountain, tens of thousands of elite troops were also climbing the mountain. The cavalry could only abandon their horses and climb the sword-suppressing mountain with their feet. Of course, their strength was also very strong. A life-and-death chase began to appear on sword-suppressing mountain. There was only one prey, but there were tens of thousands of hunters. Even if these tens of thousands of people stood still and did not resist, Chunzong would not be able to kill them all, because his strength would be exhausted before he could kill them all. Chapter 2045. Third update. Quick. Monthly votes. Finally, there was only one day left. Those who had been killed and lost all their sword seals were frantically searching for the whereabouts of other sword seal imprints. They were frantically killing and obtaining sword seals. This was their final madness. Dying. Ming Luo, Crown Prince, slashed his sword across the sky and killed his opponent directly, obtaining more than 10 sword seals. The identity chosen was very useful at the beginning, but after being killed, they would be randomly resurrected in another place, which was equivalent to starting from scratch. There was not enough time to arrange anything, so they could only rely on their own strength to hunt. In the end, no matter what identity or status one had, it would not be able to defeat the sword in one's hand. Strength was the foundation. Identity and status were the vassal brought by strength. If one did not understand this point, and instead placed more importance on identity and status, it would be putting the cart before the horse. Ming Luo, Crown Prince, thought that he had obtained the position of the Crown Prince of Suppressing Sword Country and was in control of everything. He set up an inescapable net, preparing to catch all the experts in one fell swoop and harvest a large number of sword seals to become the best candidate in this test. He did not expect that there would be an accident in the end, and that was Chunzong. He also did not expect that Chunzong's strength would be so high. Failed. Everything was in vain. However, there was indeed a useful sword Dao in the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. He could not miss this opportunity. Even if he could not become the Sword Son, he still had to fight for the position of a true disciple. If he could not even get the position of a true disciple, it would be a disgrace to his reputation as the Ming Luo Crown Prince. Thinking of Chunzong's indifferent face, Ming Luo Crown Prince could not help but burst out with anger in his heart. He did not know that before this, there was a person called Heavenly God Gong. On suppressing Sword Mountain, Chunzong's robe was tattered, and there were scratches on his arms and cheeks. Those were the scars left by the arrows that pierced through the air. Even if Chunzong was very powerful, facing the encirclement of tens of thousands of elite soldiers and thousands of arrows, he could not completely avoid them. It was already very amazing that he could guarantee that he would not be hit directly. For 2 days and 2 nights, Chunzong was constantly contending with tens of thousands of elite soldiers on Mount Fu Sword. It was a high-intensity battle, and there was no time to rest, let alone close his eyes and sleep. If he still had his cultivation, it wouldn't be a problem for him to not sleep for several days and nights. But now, he only had the physique of an ordinary person. Even if he had reached the limits of the human body and was full of energy, it would still be difficult for him to withstand such a high-intensity battle. Fortunately, Chenzong had a strong will. Otherwise, he would have collapsed long ago. Although Chenzong didn't feel good, the tens of thousands of elite soldiers didn't feel good either. They felt that they were facing a monster. That's right, it was a monster. After 2 days and 2 nights of encirclement and suppression, even though they had undergone rigorous training, it was still very difficult for them to hold on. They were very tired. Moreover, in the process of encirclement and suppression, they had lost over 1,000 people. This was the loss of over 1,000 people under seamless coordination. How amazing it was! Chenzong leaned against a large boulder. He took out an essence pill and a vitality pill and swallowed them. Then he closed his eyes and adjusted his breathing, making it slow and long. He rested for a moment, and every breath he could take was a breath of rest. There were still 2 profound chi pills and 1 spirit-nourishing pill left. He had to rely on these 2 profound chi pills and 1 spirit-nourishing pill to get through this last day. If he was killed here, he wouldn't really die, but the sword seal would disappear. All his previous gains would be in vain. Exhaustion, deep exhaustion, made Chenzong want to close his eyes and sleep. But he didn't dare to do so because he didn't know when the pursuers would appear again. The pursuers were also very tired and needed a rest. About a moment later, with the help of the essential chi pill and the vitality pill, Chenzong felt that he had recovered a lot. However, a deep exhaustion was located in the deepest part of his body and soul. It was something that the essential chi pill and the vitality pill couldn't heal. Chenzong's ears trembled slightly. He heard a slight sound. Someone was coming. It was the pursuers. He opened his eyes in an instant. Extremely sharp, cold light shot out from his eyes. His killing intent was overflowing. Chenzong didn't make any movements, but his body silently slid to the other side of the big rock. The moment Chenzong went around, dozens of sharp arrows pierced through the air. They drew beautiful arcs and were thrown to him from a distance. In just an instant, the place where Chenzong had been standing was completely covered by arrows. Ding, 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 sounds continuously rang out. That was the sound of the arrows hitting the boulders, causing countless sparks to fly. Then, hundreds of people surrounded him from the left and right in front of him. They were full of killing intent. Chenzong's figure moved. He immediately dashed to the other side like a cheetah, leaving the place. His purpose was not to kill these people, but to deal with them and pass the time. But now, the pursuers were chasing him relentlessly. They didn't want to give up at all. Dozens of elite soldiers appeared in front of them. The one leading them was obviously a soldier. He was a sword grandmaster level swordsman. Kill! The swordsman wielded his sword and took the lead to kill. Dozens of elite soldiers followed him. This kind of terrain was nothing for them, who had undergone rigorous training. There were wolves in front and tigers behind. They could only kill. Chenzong didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and unsheathed his sword. In an instant, Chenzong and the soldier crossed paths. The soldier's forward steps paused slightly, but the sword that was about to strike down stopped in midair, motionless. Chenzong's figure was like the wind, rushing into the dozens of elite soldiers like a tiger in a flock of sheep. In less than 3 breaths, Chenzong had rushed out of the encirclement of dozens of elite soldiers. Kill them all. Dozens of elite soldiers were all dead. They were powerful, had undergone rigorous training, and cooperated with each other very well. But in front of absolute strength, everything was in vain. Of course, if dozens of people turned into hundreds, it was impossible for Chenzong to kill them without paying a price. It wouldn't be that easy. It was as if they were riding on a cloud of dust. When the hundreds of pursuers arrived, they saw the figures falling down one by one. Those were their colleagues. Although it wasn't the first time they saw it these days, they were still filled with anger and killing intent. They also felt their scalps tingling. Tens of thousands of elite soldiers besieged one person. Not only did they fail to kill him, they couldn't even seriously injure him. That was fine, but more than 1,000 of them died. Chenzong didn't go down the mountain because there were more pursuers. So, he went up the mountain. Time passed slowly. Chunzong took another energy pill to replenish his energy. As for the energy pill, he didn't take it yet because it wasn't time yet. It was a life-saving item at a critical moment. The elite soldiers of Suppressing Sword Kingdom were determined to fight to the death with Chunzong. They had never suffered such a great loss before. For the honor of Suppressing Sword Kingdom and their face, they had to kill this man no matter what. With half a day left, Chunzong killed hundreds of elite soldiers again. His energy was consumed even more rapidly. 10 hours, 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours. When there were less than 2 hours left, Chunzong killed hundreds more souls with his sword. Those elite soldiers seemed to be getting crazier and crazier. They didn't fear death and brought a lot of trouble to Chunzong. Although he killed hundreds of elite soldiers, Chunzong was also shot by an arrow. Pulling out the arrow, Chunzong crushed the Jinchuang pill and sprinkled it on the arrow. A burst of burning pain spread and stopped the bleeding. It was really troublesome. That Ming Luo Crown Prince was almost flawless. Even if he was killed by Chunzong, he still left such a big trouble. Fortunately, there were less than 2 hours left. Otherwise, it would be really difficult to deal with it. It was very likely that they would be killed here. He took out the last energy pill and spirit nourishing pill and took them to recover his almost exhausted energy. It was the last moment. It was also the last moment of madness. After a while, Chunzong felt that he had recovered a lot of energy and his body was full of vitality again. However, a kind of tiredness that came from the depths of his mind became more intense. This kind of deep tiredness made Chunzong feel powerless and somewhat inexplicably irritated. The irritated feeling made Chunzong want to vent it out. How to vent it? Only kill. Breathe. Breathe. Chunzong breathed slowly. Through breathing, he recovered his energy. 15 minutes. In the end, there was only a quarter of an hour left. Thousands of elite soldiers surrounded them from all directions. This time, Chunzong didn't intend to avoid them. In the last 15 minutes, the irritated feeling in his heart became more intense. It was like a volcano that was about to erupt. It was hard to suppress. Since that was the case, he would fight. This was the last moment of madness. Clasping the long sword in his right hand, Chunzong stood up. His eyes became sharper. He had already used up the sword leaves. The only thing left was the sword in his hand. Chunzong took a step forward and flew out like a gust of wind. He lowered his body and raised his speed to the extreme. The wind whistled past his ears and made a humming sound. Chunzong felt as if he was about to fly into the sky. An indescribable feeling of pleasure spread out from the depths of his heart. The irritated feeling in his heart seemed to be alleviated. The arrows pierced through the air as if they were going to hit Chunzong like a beehive. However, with a flash of sword light, the arrows were deflected and shot down. Kill! Like a tiger in a flock of sheep, Chunzong continued to kill. As his body flashed, he killed one person with each step. Blood was everywhere. Kill him at all costs. The eyes of the general of the elite troops, who was a Sword Dao Grandmaster, were bloodshot. Seeing his subordinates being killed one after another with his own eyes, he felt extremely uncomfortable. In such a mountain, it was difficult to set up a battle formation. Its power was limited. If it were on flat ground, it would definitely not be like this. Kill! 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 As the killing began, the irritated feeling in his heart dissipated. An indescribable feeling quietly gathered. Gradually, it seemed that something was about to break out of the cocoon. This feeling turned into motivation, urging Chunzong to keep attacking with his sword, as if all the exhaustion didn't matter. The general only saw a flash of sword light in front of his eyes. An indescribable killing intent instantly bombarded him like a volcanic eruption. This killing intent made his hair stand on end. Chapter 2046. It was the beginning of July. This was the season when even Africans were crying and shouting to return home. It was also the season when one could go out and see the streets full of white legs. In May, with everyone's support and Six Paths' hard work, we achieved the honor of being the 7th most popular monthly votes. In June, we achieved the honor of being the 5th most popular monthly votes. Six Paths was wondering if he could go one step further and achieve the honor of being the 3rd most popular monthly votes. This was an unsolvable answer, as Six Paths was going to resume updating this month. Six Paths could understand his brother's desire to read more every day. It would be best if Six Paths could update 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 10 times a day. When Six Paths saw a book he liked, he would follow behind the author with a whip. He would whip the author happily and rhythmically with his own BGM. Every day, he would encourage the author to read more. Dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. Writing was a job that constantly drained one's energy, time, and energy. Of course, Six Paths loved writing and enjoyed it. However, Six Paths was not alone. Now that he had a second child, his time and energy were even more scattered. Although he could maintain 3 chapters a day, it would take up most of Six Paths' time. Morning, afternoon, and night, Six Paths was writing. He did not go back to his hometown for the holidays because once he went back, he would not have time to write and would not be able to update. His friends called him to gather, and he did not go out. It could be said that for the past 2 months, Six Paths rarely went out. Even if he did go out, he would come back in a hurry because he was thinking about writing. Tiredness was a word. He was spinning like a top. He could not sleep well at night because he could not help but think about the next plot development. Of course, Six Paths was not complaining. He was just telling everyone not to forget to spend more time with their families and friends while they were busy with work. That way, they would not be forgotten. Chapter 2047, Part 1. It was as if he had walked through the darkness for 1,000 years and woke up one morning. It was as if 1,000 people had the same dream in the same place. In the dream, everyone played a different identity and chased after the same thing. Sword Seal. Now, he had woken up from the dream. That world, that sword country, those people, and those things were like illusions, but they turned into memories and were stored in a corner of his heart. They became a part of his life experience, a small part, an insignificant part, but a part that left a deep impression in his mind. When he woke up, he was in the darkness where he had just chosen his identity. Start counting the sword seals. A low and stiff voice sounded, with a hint of coldness. At this time, some people were happy, while others were depressed. Because some people got a lot of sword seals, while some people were killed one after another because they only had one sword seal. Before long, the counting was finished. The number of sword seals that Chun Zong possessed exceeded 700. No one should have more than me. Chun Zong couldn't help but think. At the same time, almost the same voice sounded in everyone's ears. Eliminated, eliminated, eliminated. The voice of elimination hit their hearts like a sharp sword, almost suffocating them. In this way, they lost the opportunity to enter the Dongting Sword Mountain. As for a few people, the voice they heard was qualified. There was no distinction between nominal disciple, successor disciple, and so on. Perhaps it was not time yet. The voice Qinzong heard was also qualified. In the next moment, he felt his body being enveloped by a gentle force. The gentle force contained an extremely shocking sharpness, as if it could pierce through the sky and tear everything apart. The darkness was torn apart, and there was a burst of light and colorful twinkling. It was so fast and so mysterious that Chunzong had no time to sense everything around him. He only felt that he seemed to be shuttling in the void, and a sword light appeared in front of him. The sword light was eternal and immortal in the void, standing tall and motionless. Immediately, Chunzong was surprised to find that it was not sword light, but a mountain that looked like a sword. As he got closer, the mountain became bigger and bigger in front of him. It was a mountain of swords. Sword chi surged, circling the surroundings. The sword chi was like a giant dragon soaring in the sky, like a tiger roaring in the forest, like a flood dragon diving to the bottom of the sea, as if it could destroy everything. It was also like the twinkling stars in the sky, beautiful beyond compare. Occasionally, it would be like a magnificent army charging, filled with killing intent. The closer they got, the more astonished they were. The mountain grew larger and larger in their eyes, as if it was a world of its own. Chunzong felt that every strand of sword chi on it was extremely profound and vast. He didn't know how many times more powerful it was than his own sword chi. With a slight touch, he would be turned into ashes. Eastern Court, Sword Mountain. Chunzong pondered. The entire Sword Mountain completely filled up the front, as if it was infinitely enlarged, occupying the void. In the next breath, Chunzong was thrown into the Sword Mountain. His consciousness was in a state of chaos, as if he couldn't feel anything. After an unknown period of time, Chunzong woke up. He seemed to hear someone talking. "You're awake." A gentle voice came into his ears. The person who spoke was a middle-aged woman. She was still charming and had a peaceful expression on her face. She was looking at Chunzong with clear eyes. "You are." Chunzong felt an unfathomable aura from this woman, as deep as the sea. Spirit realm. This woman was definitely a spirit realm expert. Since she was a spirit realm expert, it was necessary to show respect to her. "I'm the housekeeper of the quiet autumn garden." The gentlewoman smiled. "My name is Chio Suru. You can call me Housekeeper Chio." "Housekeeper Chio, can you tell me about the situation here?" Chunzong was confused. Did he enter the Eastern Court Sword Mountain? But he didn't feel anything special. No, he felt something. The aura here was very unique. It seemed to have a trace of extremely pure sharpness, just like the aura of a sword. For a moment, Chunzong felt that his mind was very clear. His thoughts about sword art were exceptionally clear, much clearer than usual. "You've passed the test of the Sword Garden and entered the Eastern Court Sword Mountain." Housekeeper Chio smiled gently. Her tone was gentle, as if they were family. "Now, you're a true transmission disciple of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain." True transmission disciple. Chunzong thought for a while and asked, this time, "Is there anyone who wants to become the Sword Son of the Eastern Court?" "No." Housekeeper Chio smiled. "The Sword Son of the Eastern Court has a high status. It's not something you can become directly. Let me tell you about the Eastern Court Sword Mountain first." "Thank you." Chunzong took a deep breath. The Eastern Court Sword Mountain belongs to the Sword Master of the Eastern Court. It's divided into 1 main, 4 paths, and 14 meridians. 4 paths and 14 meridians. Chunzong was slightly stunned. Didn't the white light figure in the Eastern Court's Sword Garden say that there were 14 paths? The Eastern Court's 14 sword paths are basic. It's just a name. The real name is the Eastern Court's 14 sword paths, which represent the Eastern Court's 14 sword paths. The 4 paths are based on the 14 sword paths. They're the real pillars of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. The 4 paths are based on 4 of the 14 sword paths. The lineage of stars, the massacre lineage, the destruction lineage, and the mirage lineage. Housekeeper Chio's tone was somewhat serious. As for the first master, it's the Sword Master. From Housekeeper Chio's words, Chunzong had a more direct understanding of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. The understanding of the outside world was relatively simple and shallow. Only those who entered the Eastern Court Sword Mountain would understand its power and some of its mysteries. The first master referred to both a person and an inheritance. The Sword Master of the Eastern Court was the strongest and the leader of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. He was the only one who had mastered the 4 paths of the Eastern Court. In other words, only those who had mastered the 4 paths of the Eastern Court's 14 sword paths were qualified to be called the First Master. Under the First Master were the 4 sword paths, which are the Star Sword Path, the Massacre Sword Path, the Destruction Sword Path, and the Mirage Sword Path. Under the 4 sword paths were the 14 sword paths, which were equivalent to the foundation of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. For the Eastern Court Sword Mountain, it was the foundation, but for many forces in the void, it was an amazing inheritance. As for the 4 sword paths, they were even more mysterious and famous in the void. It was not that easy to become the Sword Son of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. Sword Son was a very simple title in the outside world, but there were differences in the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. Each of the 4 sword paths had a Sword Son. The sword master's lineage also had a sword son. It was almost impossible to become a sword son directly. Only by becoming a true disciple and then slowly observing and testing could one be qualified to become a sword son. The words spoken by the White Shadow in the daunting sword garden were somewhat exaggerated or unrealistic. This time, out of the 1,000 top sword cultivators from the void, less than 100 entered the Eastern Court Sword Mountain, and more than 900 were eliminated. Most of these people were listed in the 14 sword paths and became nominal disciples. A few were listed as true disciples under the 4 sword paths. According to Housekeeper Chio, the person who obtained the most sword seals in this test was Chunzong. Therefore, Chunzong was qualified to freely choose one of the 4 sword paths. As for the others, they were all assigned. Housekeeper Chio, do you have any suggestions? Chunzong had some conclusions in his mind, but he did not say them out loud. I can't give you any suggestions. Just follow your heart. Moreover, you have already made a decision in your heart. Housekeeper Chio's eyes were bright and clear, like a clear mirror that could see through everything. Chunzong closed his eyes and carefully recalled the past. He recalled everything that had happened in the country of supporting sword and followed his heart. Here, his cultivation and everything else had been unsealed. He was not suppressed in the slightest, and the sensitivity of his heart's sword essence had also been raised to the extreme. This made Chunzong feel that the potential of his heart's sword essence seemed to have been developed to the extreme. He closed his eyes. It was as if a dense fog had filled his mind. Housekeeper Chio stood aside, but did not disturb Chunzong at all. The choice was up to Chunzong himself. There seemed to be pairs of eyes staring at him through time and space, waiting for Chunzong to make a choice. Time passed slowly. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. Every breath seemed to be as long as a year. Within the country of supporting sword, one battle after another, slaughter after slaughter took place. Among the 4 great sword principles, it was certain that the Star Sword principle was related to the Sword of Star Tao. The Slaughter Sword principle was related to the Sword of Killing Tao. The Destruction Sword principle was related to the Sword of Extermination Tao. And the Mirage Sword principle was probably related to the Sword of Illusion Tao. As for the Sword of Star Tao, due to time constraints, he had not comprehended or cultivated it. Therefore, the Sword of Star Tao was not within his scope of choice. The Star Sword principle could be directly eliminated. The remaining sword principles were the Slaughter Sword principle, the Destruction Sword principle, and the Mirage Sword principle. The 3 great sword principles each had their own characteristics. Chunzong recalled the feeling when he comprehended the sword mysteries of the Killing Tao. He mobilized all his killing intent, and killing chi, completely compressing them into the sword. Just this sword alone could slaughter all life in the world. It was extremely terrifying. It was like an Azura moving unhindered. Blood flowed like rivers, and corpses were everywhere. On Mount Supporting Sword, he fought with tens of thousands of elite soldiers with only a sword. He kept killing, and one figure after another fell to the ground under his sword, losing their lives. That was the feeling of killing. It was an incomparably carefree feeling, as if there was an impulse driving him to choose to kill. In Mount Supporting Sword, the Underworld Crown Prince was extremely talented. He killed several experts with a single sword. In the end, he fought with Chunzong and decided his life and death with a single sword. Chunzong recalled the feeling at that time. That sword was called Great Destruction. It was a sword that integrated all the profound meanings of sword techniques into it. It was a sword that was extremely powerful. It was a sword that could destroy anything. Once it was unleashed, it could destroy everything. Chunzong was not very clear about the Mirage Sword principle. However, he knew that the Sword of Illusion Tao was a sword principle that focused on illusion. The Mirage Sword principle should be the same. Of course, it would be more profound and unfathomable. The Sword of Illusion had a kind of free will, as if it could evolve and control everything. It could be true or false, and it was all in one's mind. Chapter 2048. It's a guaranteed monthly vote. Remember to vote. Since ancient times, the stars have represented power. The void is indestructible, and the stars are immortal. The starry sword principle is the way of eternal power. If you choose the starry sword principle, you will live as long as the stars and as long as the void. The ancient, powerful, and domineering voice sounded as if it had passed through the endless river of time, shuttling between the past and the present, and entered Chunzong's ears. It was like a brand that Chunzong would never forget. Then, Chunzong felt the rapid changes around him. The endless void was vast and boundless. Immediately, the stars seemed to be lit up one by a pair of ancient giant hands that had penetrated time and space. The darkness seemed to have receded a little, and the vastness seemed to have become even more tranquil. It seemed to have become even more profound, as if it contained endless mysteries. Chunzong unconsciously sized it up. He felt that every speck of starlight, be it near or far, strong or weak, contained an astonishing amount of power. The starry sky was immortal, and the stars were indestructible. That kind of power was eternal and indestructible. It existed between heaven and earth in the void, and it was indestructible, and indestructible with the void. The way of strength was supreme, and it was indestructible. Strength was the foundation, the most important thing for a cultivator, and it was extremely attractive. A kind of temptation and impulse hit Chunzong's heart, shaking Chunzong's decision. Strength, unparalleled strength, indestructible strength, immortal strength, strength. Indestructible strength is just an illusion. Only killing is eternal. In an instant, a voice full of endless killing intent, as if it had penetrated the boundary of hell, descended into the void. The blood-red aura spread continuously, spreading in all directions. Every shining star in the void was dyed red. It was the color of blood, as if there was blood everywhere. Amazing killing intent was emitted from every star, filling the void, as if it was going to turn the void into a killing hell. Slaughter Sword Dao. Junior, I've seen the slaughter sword Dao that you've cultivated. The slaughter profound that you've comprehended is not bad. You're resolute in wielding your sword, and you don't hesitate to kill. You're a good seedling to cultivate my slaughter sword Dao. The voice, which seemed to have come from the depths of hell, came down with a shocking chill and murderous intent, and directly poured into Chunzong's ears. Chunzong only felt that everything in front of him had turned blood-red, as if he had entered a blood-red purgatory. Deep in his heart, waves of murderous intent continuously spread out. Murderous intent surged and churned. The murderous aura that had been accumulated from the endless killings in the past seemed to be about to erupt. The mystery of the sword of killing Dao became clearer and more intense. The power of the ultimacy of slaughter also seemed to be endlessly strengthened. This gave Chunzong a feeling that he could wipe out all living beings with a swing of his sword. That sword had turned into a true massacre, massacring all life. It was no joke. The Star Sword Principle was immortal. The Slaughter Sword Principle was massacring all life. Once again, it impacted Chunzong's heart. The stars are immortal, and the massacre is eternal. Everything will turn into nothingness under my destruction sword principle. An extremely overbearing voice sounded. The moment the voice sounded, the void trembled, and the blood-red color retreated, as if it was being torn apart. The starlight also dimmed, and then collapsed, turning into powder. Destruction. An endless aura of destruction filled the surroundings. Chunzong found that the void that he was in began to collapse under the terrifying power of destruction. Not long after, the entire starry sky was destroyed by the terrifying power of destruction. Destruction. Everything was destroyed, and everything was turned into nothingness. The so-called eternity was just a joke under the power of destruction. What you can destroy is just the appearance. The ancient voice sounded, and in the void, starlight seemed to be flickering again. So what if it's destruction? Massacre is eternal. The voice that was filled with murderous intent sounded, and the blood-red color condensed again. Strictly speaking, there was no difference between the power of stars, the power of slaughter, and the power of destruction. The only difference was that they had different natures. Destroy again. The voice of the destruction sword principle sounded again. It was extremely overbearing, and it did not allow anything else. It destroyed the flickering starlight and the condensed blood-red color again. Stars, slaughter, destruction. Nothing can withstand a single thought from me. A seemingly lazy voice sounded. That lazy voice seemed to be whispering in one's ear, and it had a power that went straight to the deepest part of one's soul. They could tell that the owner of the languid voice was a woman. They could not see her face, but just by hearing her voice, they would be filled with endless thoughts. They would not be able to stop themselves from wanting to listen to her voice more. They would not be able to stop themselves from being immersed in her voice. Even if they were to lose themselves, they would not hesitate. The voices of stars, slaughter, and destruction also fell silent. However, the void around Qinzhong began to change. The world was reborn. Mountains, rivers, grass, trees, the sun, the moon, stars, birds, beasts. Under Qinzhong's astonished gaze, a complete world, appeared. It was so vivid. If he guessed correctly, this should be the Reverie Mirage sword principle. It was unfathomable. It was as if it was creating life and things. This method was simply unfathomable, and it was difficult to distinguish. The Reverie Mirage sword principle. What do you think of the Reverie Mirage sword principle? The lazy voice sounded again, and it directly rushed into the deepest part of Qinzhong's heart. In an instant, Qinzhong almost blurted out that he would choose the Reverie Mirage sword principle. But in an instant, the heart sword essence trembled, and Qinzhong came to his senses. He quickly shut his mouth. At the same time, the world was shrinking, and it finally turned into a piece and condensed in the void. Then, starlight bloomed, the blood-red color spread, and the power of destruction expanded and contracted like a black hole. 4 sword principles. 4 extremely frightening powers. If possible, I would like to choose 4, Qinzhong said. His words caused everyone to fall silent. 4 sword principles, and he wanted to choose 4 at the same time. Any one of them, when cultivated to the extreme, can become a sword dominator. Choosing 4 sword principles is no different from cutting off your future. The ancient voice sounded with some regret. In an instant, the starlight quickly dimmed, extinguished, and disappeared. Obviously, the starry sword principle gave up on its own accord, and Qinzhong had no choice. Perhaps it felt that Qinzhong was too greedy. To master the power of slaughter, one must be focused. As the voice of the slaughter sword principle fell, the blood-red color dissipated, and in the end, only the power of the destruction sword principle and the Reverie Mirage sword principle were left. Boy, you're really good to be able to create a sword principle like the Great Destruction. I'd like to see what you can cultivate. The domineering voice of the destruction sword principle sounded with some teasing and anticipation. It's not a good thing to bite off more than one can chew, but sometimes it's also a motivation. The lazy voice sounded and did not disappear. Obviously, the destruction sword principle and the Reverie Mirage sword principle acknowledged Qinzhong. In other words, Qinzhong could cultivate the destruction sword principle and the Reverie Mirage sword principle at the same time. Although there was some regret in his heart, sometimes when making a choice, you're also faced with the choice of others. Although he wanted to choose 4 sword principles, after all, Qinzhong was very determined. His sword will was the heart sword will, which was the supreme sword will. Then his sword principle should be related to the heart sword will. Even the way will that had not been completely transformed would be related to his sword principle. The 4 sword principles were very mysterious. As the ancient voice of the starry sword principle said, any one of the 4 sword principles, when cultivated to the extreme, could become a sword dominator. However, he did not intend to cultivate all 4 sword principles to the extreme. Instead, he intended to comprehend the mysteries of the 4 sword principles and absorb their essence, to perfect and expand his own sword principle accumulation. From the very beginning, Chunzong had never forgotten his roots. Perhaps cultivating the legacy left by others could save him a lot of detours and improve faster, but after all, it did not belong to him. It would be fast in the beginning, but it would be limited when he reached a high level. However, if it belonged to him completely, he would take detours at the beginning and accumulate constantly. It would be very slow, but when it exploded, it would be very amazing and full of stamina. The first path was suitable for most cultivators, and the second path was only suitable for outstanding cultivators who had full confidence in themselves. Moreover, the success rate of the second path was very, very low. However, Chunzong had been moving forward on this path, and it was absolutely impossible for him to give up. Although he could not comprehend the Star Sword Principle and the Slaughter Sword Principle, it was not bad to be able to comprehend the Destruction Sword Principle and the Reverie Mirage Sword Principle. When Chunzong made his choice, everything disappeared. When he opened his eyes, Butler Chiu was standing in front of him and looking at him. Chunzong could see the indescribable surprise on Butler Chiu's face. This was because Chunzong had a sword token in each hand. One was a black sword token, which exuded an aura of destruction that could destroy everything. It represented the identity of the Destruction Sword Principle and was a token. This was very normal, which meant that Chunzong had chosen the Destruction Sword Principle. However, what was up with the green sword token in his other hand? The cyan sword token had a misty and dreamy aura, and Butler Chiu knew very well that it represented the Reverie Mirage Sword Principle. What did it mean for two sword tokens to appear in the same person's hands at the same time? It meant that he had been chosen by two major sword principles at the same time. It was not that there were no such people in Dongting Sword Mountain, but there were very few of them. In Butler Chiu's memory, there were only a few people from many years ago until now. It seemed that this young man was much more outstanding than he had imagined. Since he had chosen two major sword principles, Chunzong naturally would not waste any time. Cultivation was a race against time. However, he was still quite unfamiliar with Dongting Sword Mountain, so he still had to consult Butler Chiu about many things. After all, Butler Chiu was from here, and his understanding of Dongting Sword Mountain was definitely not something that he could compare with. Chapter 2049. Everyone, please remember to pay attention to the public account. 6 realms sink into oblivion. The Sword Mountain of Dongting had one main path for paths and 14 meridians, all of which were located within the mountain. This Sword Mountain itself was a powerful treasure. Nourished by the sword chi of Sword Master Dongting and other powerful sword cultivators, it became even more amazing. It stood in the void of the universe, and its scale was not inferior to that of a middle-rank star. However, the level of the sword chi in it was completely comparable to the level of the essence of the world of a top-rank star. The first main path was at the highest point of the Sword Mountain. The 4 paths were in the middle, and the 14 meridians were at the foot of the mountain. The 4 paths also had 4 major Dao academies, namely the Starry Dao Academy, the Massacre Dao Academy, the Destruction Dao Academy, and the Sonorous Mirage Dao Academy. Now, Chunzong was a true disciple of both the Destruction Dao Academy and the Sonorous Mirage Dao Academy. This time, according to Chunzong's understanding, there were not many people who had become true disciples. There were only about 10 of them, and they were scattered among the 4 major Dao colleges. Each Dao college might only have a few, or even only one. The White Yama that Chunzong knew was a true disciple of the Massacre Dao Academy. As for the Underworld Crown Prince, he was a true disciple of the Starry Dao Academy. The Sword Maniac was also from the Starry Dao Academy, the Sword Demon from the Massacre Dao Academy, the Sword Ghost from the Massacre Dao Academy, and the Sword Demon from the Sonorous Mirage Dao Academy. Chunzong was the only one who was a true disciple of 2 major Dao academies. Chunzong didn't know that even the Dongting Sword Master was paying attention to him. Did you choose the 2 sword paths because you're confident in cultivating them simultaneously, or do you have other inheritances and intend to learn the essence of the 2 sword paths and innovate. At the highest point of the Sword Mountain, a blurry figure that didn't seem to exist in the void spoke in a low voice. The voice was constantly changing. There was a faint sense of anticipation. Chunzong arrived at the Destruction Dao Academy first. Within the Destruction Dao Academy, there was a shocking aura everywhere. The aura seemed to be able to destroy everything. It was terrifying. The people of the Destruction Dao Academy weren't bad either. There was one Academy Master, 2 Vice Academy Masters, less than 10 Elders, and less than 100 true disciples. Most of the true disciples were at the Ascension Realm, and only a few that had just been recruited were at the Demigod Realm. This was a very pure and thorough newbie. He's really ambitious to choose 2 Sword Daos. A direct disciple at the Spirit Realm glanced at Chunzong. His voice was neither loud nor soft, but there was some indescribable disdain in it. I heard that they wanted to choose the 4 Great Sword Principles, but were rejected by the Star Sword Principle and the Massacre Sword Principle. There are countless cultivators. There will always be some self-righteous people. Biting off more than one can chew, and being arrogant will ultimately lead to nothing. All kinds of voices entered his ears, but Chunzong didn't seem to hear them. His expression didn't change at all. That was because there was simply no need to pay attention to it. A battle of words was ultimately inferior. Only by displaying outstanding ability and letting them know how foolish and ignorant their words were would they be able to counterattack. Only by doing so would they be able to do so. Of course, if he was strong enough. Chunzong was more inclined to draw his sword directly. The fact that Chunzong had been summoned by the Dean of the Destruction Dao Academy made the others even more jealous. After all, when they had become true disciples, they hadn't been summoned by the Dean. Some had been summoned by the Elders, and the best had been the Deputy Dean. As far as they knew, there were very few who could be summoned by the Dean after becoming a true disciple. Now, all of them were extremely shocking existences. Now, this arrogant and conceited person had been summoned by the Dean as soon as he arrived. How could they not be surprised and jealous? Kid, you're very ambitious. An extremely domineering voice rang out in the darkness that seemed to be constantly being destroyed. It was so domineering that it didn't tolerate anything else. Chunzong recognized it immediately. It was one of the voices that had spoken when he was about to make a choice. It was the Dean of the Destruction Dao Academy. That was really shocking. At that time, it was the Dean of the 4 major Dao Academies who had explained the mysteries of the various sword principles to him and asked him to choose. It was enough to show how much they valued him. Chunzong felt honored, but he wasn't overly excited. All right, there's nothing else. Go and meditate on it yourself. I'd like to see what you can comprehend. As soon as he finished speaking, Chunzong felt a repulsive force directly sending him out of the void that seemed to be constantly being destroyed in an overbearing manner. The inheritance of the Destruction Sword Principle was both simple and difficult. One had to comprehend it on their own. There was no one to teach you directly. You had to comprehend it on your own before you were qualified to be taught. However, in order to truly comprehend the Sword Principle, one had to reach the Ascension Realm. Entering the Dao was the level of the Ascension Realm. The Dao below the Ascension Realm was all pseudo-Dao. Chunzong began to comprehend the Dao of the Destruction Dao Academy. The 14 meridians were further subdivided into 10 minor meridians and 4 major meridians. The 4 major meridians were destruction, killing, star, and illusion. The minor meridians were metal, wood, water, fire, earth, wind, ice, thunder, light, and darkness. The various sword arts he had cultivated in the sword garden were only the basic sword arts of each meridian. In order to master the Destruction Sword Principle, one had to first master the basic sword arts of the Destruction Dao Academy, as well as other sword arts. Only after cultivating them to a certain level would one truly comprehend the essence of the Destruction Dao Academy. Only then would one be considered to have stepped into the Destruction Dao Academy. However, that was only the threshold. There was still a long way to go before one could truly master the Destruction Sword Principle. After that, one would have to constantly study and cultivate the sword arts of the other meridians. Then, one would have to extract the mysteries of the destruction Tao and fuse them together. The more one extracted and fused, the easier it would be for one to master the destruction sword principle. Thus, among the true disciples of the Destruction Tao Academy, some were faster, while others were slower. Chunzong had only cultivated the Destruction Tao, sword of the Destruction Tao Academy. That was the foundation, and he had already grasped it to the extreme. Next, he would cultivate the other sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy. To Chunzong, this was a good thing. It would be difficult for a disciple of the Destruction Tao Academy to cultivate the other sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy. However, wasn't difficult for a true disciple of the Destruction Tao Academy. Void annihilation. Void annihilation. Destruction of all forms. Destruction of heaven and earth. Within the Destruction Tao Academy, one could directly comprehend all the sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy. Each of those sword arts could be considered to be based on the Destruction Tao sword. However, they were all even more profound and powerful than the Destruction Tao sword. Within the Destruction Tao Academy, Chunzong was in seclusion, wholeheartedly cultivating the sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy. He was completely oblivious to the passage of time. He was like a dried-up sponge, crazily absorbing seawater to enrich himself. The sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy were truly profound and unfathomable. Chunzong's comprehension of the Tao of the sword was fully unleashed, providing a shocking boost to his comprehension of the sword arts. Unknowingly, when Chunzong came out of seclusion, the essence, energy, and spirit flowers in his divine sea had completely turned into nothingness, vanishing without a trace. Only the flower of the great extreme remained, swaying endlessly. This meant that Chunzong had already reached the peak of the demigod realm. At least in terms of cultivation base, there was no way for him to advance any further. However, in terms of sword arts, there seemed to be no limit to how far he could advance. At least until now, after cultivating the sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy, Chunzong felt that his strength had improved by quite a bit. His battle prowess had also increased. Although he had not fully grasped the sword arts of the Destruction Tao Academy, he had already comprehended them. All that was left was to cultivate diligently. Chunzong began to choose the sword arts of the other Tao Academies. Wind, fire, thunder, and so on all contained elements of destruction, which could be comprehended. The sword arts of the Water Tao Academy could also be comprehended. This was because when water turned into a torrent, it could also destroy everything. It also contained elements of destruction. The Earth Tao Academy also contained elements of destruction. In short, if one were to observe carefully, one would know that the various forces of all Tao Academies contained elements of destruction. Chunzong relied on his superb comprehension and memory to forcibly memorize all the sword arts of the minor Tao Academies. He memorized them in his mind and slowly comprehended them. When people found out about this, they were all shocked and disdainful, biting off more than you can chew. He is indeed a greedy and arrogant person. Other than Swordmaster Dongting himself, no one else had done so. Even the Academy Masters of the four major Tao Academies had not done so. However, Chunzong had done so, so it was normal for people to say such things. Of course, they did not know that Chunzong's true goal was not to comprehend and master the Destruction Sword Tao, but to improve his own accumulation of sword arts in preparation for his own Sword Tao in the future. The Destruction Sword Tao was only a springboard for Chunzong. It was the same for the Reverie Mirage Sword Tao. If the Academy Masters of the Stars Sword Tao and the Massacre Sword Tao had not rejected Chunzong, these two Sword Taos would have become the foundation of Chunzong's Sword Tao. Then, should I go to the Reverie Mirage Tao Academy? Chunzong muttered to himself and left the Destruction Tao Academy. The aura of the Reverie Mirage Tao Academy was completely different from that of the Destruction Tao Academy. The aura that filled the place was misty and dreamlike, but also vivid and lifelike. It was like reality and illusion, like a dream and an illusion. Reality and illusion overlapped and changed constantly, making it difficult to distinguish and determine. If one was not careful, one could be lost in it. Chunzong did not hesitate. He stepped forward and walked in. Then, Chunzong realized that there seemed to be countless beautiful women dancing in front of him. They had all kinds of dancing postures and graceful figures. There was an indescribable temptation that seemed to reach directly to the deepest part of his heart and arouse his deepest desire. It was restless, as if it was about to explode. Even the heart sword trembled slightly, but it could only barely keep Chunzong awake. It was difficult. It was very difficult to resist. As if sensing Chunzong's resistance, the dancing postures became even more seductive. Half of the gauze dress was undone, and it was faintly discernible. The flames in the depths of his heart kept burning. It was as if a single spark was about to turn into a prairie fire. Chunzong's expression kept changing. He kept resisting. The heart sword trembled more and more violently. Waves of sword hums were melodious, but it was somewhat hurried. Chunzong was sure that if he lost control, he would definitely make a fool of himself. He might even do something that he should not do. It would be very disadvantageous for him. Chapter 2050. The hot breath, the fragrance of orchids, and the soft and boneless body wrapped around him. It was as if he was having a pink dream. The heart sword intent vibrated unceasingly. Chunzong continued to defend against the terrifying attacks. To Chunzong, it was a kind of invasion. All right, a faintly discernible voice rang out. Immediately, the fragrant wind beauty's light paused for a moment, and then she turned into smoke and dissipated. It was so real, as if it was a real person, but it turned into nothingness in an instant. Mirage. It was like a mirage. He had been completely deceived and believed it to be real. If someone hadn't spoken in the end, he would have made a fool of himself. Chunzong couldn't help but let out a long sigh. The fog in front of him seemed to dissipate. Chunzong saw grass, trees, mountains, and rocks. This Mirage Dao Academy was different from the Destruction Dao Academy. It was like a miniature world. Although you're a little arrogant, you do have some skills. A blurred voice sounded with a hint of mockery. Humph, you almost fell for it. Another voice sounded. It was a little unconvinced. That's enough. Why don't you think about your cultivation level and his cultivation level? Chunzong was summoned again. The person who summoned him was the Lord of the Mirage Dao Academy. It was also very enviable. However, Chunzong didn't actually see the Lord of the Mirage Dao Academy. He only heard his voice. The lazy voice had an inexplicable power that reached the deepest part of one's heart and soul. It was unforgettable. Although the Lord of the Mirage Dao Academy's voice was lazy and slow, he said more. He also passed on some information to Chunzong. It was some explanation about the mysteries of the Mirage sword art. Go and cultivate well. With that last sentence, he asked Chunzong to leave. The Mirage sword art was based on the Mirage Dao Academy. One had to comprehend and master the mysteries and essence of the Mirage Dao Academy's Mirage Dao Academy. It kept deepening and accumulating. Then, it kept integrating the mysteries of the Mirage Dao Academy's minor 10 meridians. In the wind, there were mysteries of illusions. In the water, there were mysteries of illusions. In fact, if one looked deeper, fire, lightning, and so on also contained mysteries of illusions. The mysteries of the Tao of illusion were hidden deep within all things in the world. What was real and what was false. The Tao of illusion was only the foundation of the reverie, mirage, sword Tao. Chunzong began to comprehend the secrets of the reverie mirage sword Tao that the dean of the Mirage Tao Academy had imparted to him. It mentioned that when one's comprehension of the Tao of illusion reached the pinnacle and surpassed its limits, one would be able to reach a completely new level. That was the level that opposed destruction. Creation. The method of creating things out of thin air was like the method of a real god. With a single thought, all living things would appear and exist in one's heart, acting according to one's will. Chunzong was astonished when he read the message. After all, in Chunzong's understanding, illusion meant transformation. Illusions and illusions were all fake. Even if they were lifelike and fake as real, they were still fake in essence. It was a superb technique that deceived one's 5 or even 6 senses. However, the dean of the Reverie Mirage Dao Academy said that once one reached an extremely high level of the Dao of illusion and broke through the limits, it would reach a completely new level. It was a level that was like the creation of a god. One would be able to break free from the shackles of the fake and become real, turning the fake into the real. What kind of shocking method was this? It was simply unimaginable. If that was the case, it could prove that the Reverie Mirage Sword Dao was probably the most profound of the 4 major Sword Daos of the East Court Sword Mountain. In terms of power, the Star Sword Dao was the most powerful. In terms of killing, the Massacre Sword Dao was the most powerful. In terms of destruction, the Destruction Sword Dao was the most powerful. However, in terms of unfathomability and potential, the Reverie Mirage Sword Dao was the most powerful. Second to none, it was number 1. Many people understood that it was easier to destroy than to create. In order to build or create something, one had to first understand and familiarize themselves with the knowledge and structure of that thing. Then, one had to spend a lot of time and energy carefully and painstakingly to construct it. Only then could one succeed. There was also the possibility of failure during the process. However, one did not have to think so much about destruction. Whether one was familiar with the knowledge and structure of that thing or not did not hinder one from destroying it. One could directly use violence to destroy it. No matter what kind of structure it was, one could destroy it all. Therefore, the key to destruction was to have enough power. Speaking of which, creation was more difficult and more brilliant than destruction. The end of the Reverie Mirage Sword Dao was to surpass the limits and turn it into creation. It also mentioned that everything in the Reverie Mirage Dao Academy, such as the mountains, rocks, plants, and so on, did not exist. Instead, they were condensed from the mysteries of the Dao of Mirage and could be compared to the real thing. The more Chunzong understood, the more shocked he was. How profound and profound it was. However, it was too far away from his current level. It was unimaginable. Let's cultivate. Chunzong began to comprehend the other martial arts of the illusion lineage. The martial arts of the illusion lineage were mainly swordsmanship, but there were also martial arts of other aspects that formed the complete illusion lineage. It was based on the sword of illusion Dao. Chunzong had already cultivated the sword of illusion Dao to the extreme. He had mastered the mysteries and had a solid foundation. Green eyes of illusion, illusory body manipulation, illusory clouds, 36 styles, infinity technique of heaven and earth transformation. Chunzong's goal was not to cultivate all of them to the extreme. That would take too much time. After all, in addition to the martial arts of the illusion lineage, there were also the martial arts of the destruction lineage and the martial arts of the other 10 lineages. There were too many martial arts in total. He was only one person, so his energy and time were limited. The most important thing was to comprehend the essence and mysteries contained in the martial arts of each lineage. Cultivating martial arts was only the means and process. Mastering the essence and mysteries was the foundation. The mysteries were profound and unfathomable. Chunzong decided to spend some time to comprehend them. As a true disciple of the 2 major Dao colleges, Chunzong was naturally arranged his own residence and began to cultivate in seclusion. As for the outside world, the news had already spread. For example, how many people from the 100 Dongting Sword Gardens passed the Sword Conference and were selected? Then, how many people were eliminated in the second test? How many people could truly enter the Dongting Sword Mountain and become a disciple? Of course, the outside world did not know whether those who entered the Dongting Sword Mountain were registered disciples or true disciples. For the outside world, it was easy to find out about the Dongting Sword Mountain. However, for more detailed information, those who did not have a certain status did not know. But no matter what, most of the genius sword cultivators had been eliminated. Many of them were famous figures in various star systems. So, those who could enter the daunting Sword Mountain and become a disciple must be very amazing. Okay. When Suowan knew that Chunzong was among the dozens of people who had entered the daunting Sword Mountain, he could not help but smile. He was very excited, and it came from the bottom of his heart. The daunting Sword Mountain was an extremely powerful existence in the void. It was more than 100 times, or even 1,000 times stronger than the Yuan sect. Perhaps it was not a big deal for the strongest person in the Yuan sect to enter the daunting Sword Mountain. Since Chunzong could enter the daunting Sword Mountain, he definitely had a promising future. When Yin Zhun heard the news, his face darkened. The godson of the Sword Palace was indeed a very amazing identity in the two galaxies ruled by the Yuan sect. However, for the entire star system, it was only considered as good. For the entire void, it was not a big deal. The daunting Sword Mountain was very powerful. Who knew how many spirit realm experts there were who were stronger than him? Chunzong could enter the daunting Sword Mountain and become a disciple. It was enough to show that his talent was amazing. When he succeeded in his cultivation, it would be disadvantageous for him. However, there was nothing he could do. Among the people who had entered the daunting Sword Garden in the Yuan Galaxy, only 2 people had passed the test and entered the daunting Sword Mountain. One was Chunzong, the Heavenly Sword. The other was by Yama. As for the others, whether they were the true disciples of the Yuan sect, the Fengling sect, or the Heavenly Punishment Army, they were all eliminated. Perhaps it was not that they were not strong enough, but they were just unlucky. For example, the young marshal of the Heavenly Punishment Army and the eldest senior brother of the Fengling sect had the hope of entering the daunting Sword Mountain. At least, they could have become registered disciples. However, when they were in the Suppressing Sword Country, they received the Underworld Crown Prince's challenge letter and went to the Suppressing Sword Mountain. Later, they died there, and all the sword seals they had obtained were gone. Although they worked very hard in the following period of time, their gains were not great. In the end, they were not lucky enough to be eliminated. If they had not gone to the Suppressing Sword Mountain, there was a 70 to 80% chance that they would have become registered disciples of the daunting Sword Mountain. However, people judged heroes by their success or failure. Only they could experience the process. Outsiders could not understand it at all, let alone pay attention to it. No matter how hard you worked, it was your own business. Whether you succeeded in the end was the focus of attention of outsiders. 100 daunting sword gardens, 1,000 candidates. In the end, less than 100 geniuses entered the daunting Sword Mountain. 2 of them were from the Yuan Galaxy. It was very shocking and attracted a lot of discussion. Bayama became famous earlier than the Heavenly Sword. He came from a humble family, but because of a great adventure, he rose to fame and became famous in the airspace of the second suppressing world city in the Yuan Galaxy. Now, he was even more famous. As for the Heavenly Sword Chunzong, he became famous later and fewer people knew about him. He first became famous in the second suppressing world city. However, his background seemed to be even lower. He seemed to be a native of a remote planet. Because of some accident, he wandered into the void. He was lucky enough to be brought to the second suppressing world city by the second miss of the Lin family, and his road to fame began. In the Lin family of the Ring Sword planet, many people were beaming with joy. At least Chunzong and Lin Wayne had a good relationship. They had a good foundation. Maybe in the future, they would have to rely on each other. As for the Chu family of the Mountain River planet, the situation was different from the Lin family. Because of Chu Shanha, the Chu family had many bad relations with Chunzong. After they failed to recruit Chunzong, they even planned to kill him. They were saved by the city lord Su Luan and were warned. Just like that, the grudge between them was formed. Chapter 2051. I wonder how many of my friends have forgotten about this. The Lin family of the Sword Ring planet was happy because they were related to Chunzong, while the Mountain River planet bit because they had a conflict with Chunzong. However, Chunzong, the person involved, had no idea. In the sword mountain of Dongting Court, Chunzong was in seclusion. He ignored everything else and focused on comprehending the martial arts and sword techniques of the illusion lineage. The aura around Chunzong began to become misty. As it permeated the air, it felt unreal. It was like the moon in the water, dreamy and blurred. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, more than half a year had passed. The aura around Chunzong gradually faded and then retracted, as if it had disappeared. He opened his eyes, which were as clear as water. Suddenly, layers of ripples spread out. Suddenly, the air under his gaze changed, as if it had been injected with a dreamy aura. Chunzong closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were as clear as water again. His cultivation had come to an end. It was time to leave seclusion. Cultivation was about balancing work and rest. When one felt that it was about time to stop, one should stop. One could not force it. Otherwise, it would only put a burden on oneself and bring about negative consequences. Chunzong's residence was within the Destruction Dao Academy. The illusionary mirage Dao Academy gave Chunzong a strange, unpredictable, and rather dangerous feeling. Walking out of the Destruction Dao Garden, Chunzong walked halfway up the sword mountain. As he walked, he emptied his mind. "Chunzong, take my sword." A somewhat wild voice suddenly sounded. It was like a sudden explosion of thunder, directly rushing into one's ears. Then, an extremely powerful sword light suddenly flashed. It was like a ball of bright starlight, like a supernova exploding in an instant. It burst forth with unparalleled violent power and directly attacked. Star lineage, celestial explosion, sword technique. This sword technique was more profound and powerful than the Sword of Star Path. However, to cultivate it, one must have the foundation of the Sword of Star Path. The person who attacked was Jian Kuang. Jian Kuang was, of course, not his real name. It was just a nickname because of his personality and sword style. Belligerent. The sword maniac was a battle maniac. In the star field where he was from, demigod rank experts were well known. However, ever since he had entered the Eastern Court Sword Mountain, he had become an heir disciple of the Stellar Dao Academy. After sparring with the other heirs who had entered the Stellar Dao Academy with him a few times, they had begun to avoid him and no longer fought with him. Looking for the true disciples of the previous generation or even the generation before that. They were all at the spirit realm. Fighting with spirit realm experts was simply courting death. Aside from the new true disciples, there were no other demigod rank experts in the entire Eastern Court Sword Mountain. All of them were eminent deities. Therefore, Sword Maniac had set his sights on the new disciples of the other academies. Unfortunately, everyone was cultivating, and he would occasionally come out to try his luck. This time, he met Chunzong. First, Zhang Xian warned Zhang Xian. Then, he drew his sword and executed the minor celestial explosion sword art, which he had cultivated to a certain level. As the sword slashed out, starlight exploded, bursting forth with astonishing power. The power within was extremely tyrannical, as if it could destroy everything in its path. Chunzong reacted instantly and slashed out with his sword. Phaseless annihilation sword art. As the sword slashed out, an astonishing aura of destruction immediately spread out, as if it could destroy the void. It was extremely terrifying, and the exploding starlight was instantly shattered and destroyed. Jian Kuang's pupils shrank to the size of needles. Then he grinned, as if he was very excited. He completely activated his strength, holding the heavy sword with both hands and raising it high. Endless starlight shone and condensed on the sword. Minor celestial domain suppression sword art. As the sword slashed down, the sword disappeared. Only an enormous and extremely bright starlight shone, as if it had been drawn from the deepest part of the void. It transformed into an ancient star that descended from the sky, suppressing heaven and earth. This sword art was the strongest sword art in the stellar lineage. In terms of level, it was at the level of a lesser mystique. However, it was at the peak of lesser mystiques, infinitely close to a greater mystique. The sword transformed into a celestial star that descended, suppressing the earth. Chunzong's sword paused in an instant, as if it had been crushed in an instant. The destructive power shattered layer by layer. As the sword transformed into a celestial star, everything disappeared. Chunzong only felt that an invisible and unparalleled force was suppressing him, as if to suppress him for eternity. However, Chunzong was not nervous at all. This power was indeed strong, but it was nothing. As long as he wanted to, he could break it. However, it might be good to change the method. When the sword rose, there seemed to be strands of aura spreading out. It was like a dream, an illusion, quietly spreading out. As the sword light turned, the clouds and mist changed, and the wind blew. Illusory cloud flowing edge 36 styles. This was a superb sword art in the illusory lineage. Of course, in terms of level, it was not as good as the celestial suppressing domain sword. However, when displayed by Chunzong, it was unfathomable and mysterious. Coupled with the illusory body, it was even more exquisite. Jian Kuang slashed out with his sword, only to feel that everything before his eyes was destroyed by his sword. That was a boundless might, incomparably tyrannical and berserk, directly crushing everything before it, suppressing everything in its path, suppressing everything in its path, suppressing everything in its path, causing it to be unable to break free for all eternity. The mystery of the stellar sword principle lay in power and immortality. When the two were completely integrated, the true power of the stellar sword principle could be displayed. The little heavenly star domain suppression sword that Jian Kuang had used had not reached that level yet. But now, he could feel that the power of that level was displayed by his own sword. Even though it was only the tip of the iceberg, it was still very shocking. This kind of power made him feel that he had surpassed the demigod realm and was comparable to the divine realm. What a powerful power! Jian Kuang, who worshipped power, could not help but feel intoxicated. Little did he know that he had already been hit by Chunzong's sword art in the illusory lineage. A faintly discernible sword light seemed to be refracted in the void, avoiding everything and directly attacking. Jian Kuang only felt a piercing pain between his eyebrows, as if his divine soul had been pierced. He instantly woke up. Chunzong's sword gently touched Jian Kuang's eyebrows. Jian Kuang knew that he had been defeated. His defeat was inexplicable. How did you do it? Jian Kuang could not help but frown and ask. He liked to fight, but he could afford to lose. The illusory lineage, Chunzong replied with a smile. If it was a life and death battle, he could easily take Jian Kuang's life. In Chunzong's eyes, Jian Kuang's strength was definitely very strong. He was much stronger than the young marshal of the Heavenly Punishment Army and the eldest senior brother of the Fengling sect. He was second only to Ming Luo Crown Prince. As for the Yuan sect's true disciples, Jian of No Return and Bai Mei, although they were also very strong, they could not be compared to Jian Kuang. Jian Kuang was only at the pinnacle of the demigod rank. The gap between them was huge. However, Jian Kuang was definitely stronger than Ming Luo Crown Prince. This was confidence. Jian Kuang was very depressed. He liked to fight head-on. When faced with the illusory lineage's martial arts, he felt inferior. It seemed as if he had become very strong, but that was just an illusion. On the contrary, he was actually restrained and could not truly let go. He was speechless. After thinking it through, Jian Kuang no longer looked for Chunzong to fight. To Chunzong, this was just a small interlude. After going into seclusion, he had come out to take a stroll and relax, only to have a battle occur. This made Chunzong realize just how profound the sword arts of the Eastern Court Sword Mountain were. After strolling around, Chunzong returned to the Destruction Dao Academy and went into seclusion again. This time, he was comprehending the sword arts of the Destruction lineage. As he was comprehending, Chunzong suddenly sensed the Dao intent that was constantly transforming within his deity ocean. Countless forces were colliding and exploding in the depths of the Dao intent, as if they could destroy everything. Wasn't that the power of destruction? Shenzong was greatly moved. So it turned out that this was a situation within the Tao insight that had undergone a metamorphosis. The power of destruction deepened Shenzong's understanding of the destruction lineage's sword arts, and his efficiency instantly increased by several times. Shenzong continued to comprehend and master the various sword techniques of the destruction lineage. Shenzong also discovered that the deeper his understanding of the profundity and essence of the sword techniques of the destruction lineage, the more tyrannical the destructive power within the metamorphosed Tao intent seemed to be. The speed at which it evolved also seemed to be faster. Could this method help him complete the transformation of this Tao intent as soon as possible? Shenzong couldn't help but wonder. Comprehend, comprehend, comprehend. Shenzong continued to comprehend the mysteries of metal, wood, water, fire, earth, wind, ice, lightning, light, darkness, and so on. All the mysteries of the destruction lineage were comprehended and mastered by him. This feeling was incomparably wonderful. In a short period of time, the effect of his comprehension was 10 times better than before. Shenzong even suspected that the new Tao intent he wanted to master was the destruction Tao intent. Or was it a Tao intent that was related to the destruction Tao intent? Shenzong didn't know if it was true or not, and it was only a guess. But now, he seemed to be sure of one thing, and it was that the Tao insights during this transformation were obviously helpful to his comprehension of the profundities of the Tao of destruction. Similarly, when he obtained progress in his comprehension of the various profundities of the Tao of destruction, it was able to strengthen the energy of destruction within the Tao insights and speed up the transformation. Speeding up meant shortening the time. Shenzong couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Previously, this Tao intent had always been in the process of transforming, yet it had not completed its transformation for a long time. This caused Shenzong to go from anticipation to indifference. Gradually, he didn't pay much attention to it and just waited for it to complete its transformation. After all, he was completely unable to sense the changes within it at that time. It was different now. It seemed that his choice of the destruction sword Tao intent was indeed correct. It was a choice that followed his heart. Following his heart's choice was indeed the correct way. Then, let me complete the transformation of this second Tao intent here and see what kind of Tao intent it would be. Shenzong felt that this second Tao intent might be like the heart sword intent, and it was also a type of supreme Tao intent. Supreme Tao intent. Supreme Tao intent. It was an ultimate power. Comprehension and evolution promoted and complemented each other. Shenzong didn't know how much time had passed, nor did he know how much time had passed. He only felt that the destructive power of the transforming second Tao intent had already accumulated to the limit. Chapter 2052. I was so busy thinking about what to eat that I forgot to update. What a sin. What was the ultimate destruction? It was an explosion that completely destroyed everything and turned everything into nothingness. The chaotic will of the way in the transformation of his spirit sea was instantly blasted apart by the ultimate destruction. At that moment, Shenzong felt as if his spirit had been blown apart. Emptiness. Nothingness. Everything disappeared. Nothing existed. Everything returned to nothingness. What was nothingness? It meant that there was nothing left. Nothing existed. He couldn't feel his body, soul, or thoughts. He couldn't feel anything. Am I going to die just like that? A thought suddenly condensed into nothingness. He didn't expect that he would die just as he was about to transform into the second will of the way. Shenzong could feel that when he constantly comprehended the various mysteries of destruction of the lineage of destruction, he seemed to have developed a trace of unimaginable power. That power was the power of destruction, an incomparably brilliant power. It was that trace of power that caused the chaotic will of the way to explode and turn into nothingness. It was as if even his spirit sea and everything else had turned into nothingness. Am I going to die just like that? He didn't want to accept this. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Sure enough, there were risks in cultivation. The greater the harvest, the greater the risk. So this time, did he fail to take the risk and say goodbye to everything? No. If he was really dead, how could he still think about these questions? Was it terminal lucidity? No. Chunzong was certain that he was still alive, his thoughts were still there, and his will was still there. He wasn't dead. However, even if he wasn't dead, he was now in nothingness. How was he going to escape? Where should he go? Chunzong was at a loss. Suddenly, Chunzong recalled the profundities of the four-sword Tao schoolmasters. Stars and slaughter were all destroyed by the power of destruction and turned into nothingness. However, as the power of the sea serpent appeared, the mountains and rivers, the sun, the moon, and the stars all turned into a world. It was as if a new world was created from nothingness. With a thought, the nothingness began to change. The mysteries of the Taichu sword energy technique also emerged. Strands of air appeared in the void. More and more of them appeared, and they became denser and denser. Suddenly, the air began to divide. The turbid chi sank, and the clear chi rose. The sinking turbid air continued to accumulate and solidify, turning into a piece of land. The rising clear air continued to spread out, becoming more and more ethereal, turning into a sky. As the countless auras continued to spread, the earth and the sky continued to expand, becoming increasingly vast. In the sky, wisps of clouds filled the air, condensing into drifting white clouds. On the ground, pieces of earth rose up and turned into mountains. Pieces of earth sank and cracked, turning into ravines. Rain fell from the sky, becoming increasingly majestic and violent, covering the sky and earth. The ravine was filled with water. When it flowed, it became a river. It was unknown when, but on both sides of the river, sprouts broke through the soil and gradually grew. It was as if dozens of years of time had been condensed into an instant. The sprouts grew into towering trees with luxuriant foliage. The wind blew from afar, blowing through the forest, causing the leaves to sway and rustle. It caused the river to surge and ripple. The river surged and converged into a huge, deep pit, turning into a sea. Rivers, lakes, and seas were all formed. Mountains and hills stretched as far as the eye could see. Vegetation was continuous, lush, and exuberant. Then, in the sky, a spot of light condensed and gradually enlarged, emitting a dazzling light. The light shone on the ground, flowing on the ground and beyond all living things. It was sunlight. It was the scorching sun. In the shadow of the sunlight, a crescent moon also condensed. It was faintly discernible, looking at the scorching sun from afar. When the scorching sun set in the west, it would leap out of the east and dance with the night. Specks of starlight were hidden in the sky. That was the light of the stars. Heaven and earth. World. Just like that, a world was formed and displayed. Supreme, supreme, supreme. The sound of the heavens was vast and mighty, and the sound of the Tao spread. That was the sound of the great path. It was the sound of the heavenly way, descending directly from the void. Outside the Dongting Sword Mountain, in the void, colorful lights continued to converge, turning into a rippling lake. The lake was incomparably vast. It was the nine-colored light lake. When Shenzong broke through the limits of sword will in Tianyuan's sacred domain and mastered supreme heart sword will, the great path heavenly voice and the nine-colored light lake had also appeared. However, at that time, there were restrictions in Tianyuan's sacred domain, so they were not fully displayed. Now, in Dongting Sword Mountain, it was many times more powerful than in Tianyuan's sacred domain. It was directly connected to the void, without any barriers, and its power was fully displayed. The nine-colored heavenly lake continued to spread, condensing incomparable mysteries. It was the mysteries of the great path in the void. Countless mysteries merged, intertwined, and collided with each other. The great path heavenly voice was vast. No one could clearly hear what it was chanting, but they could tell that it contained amazing mysteries. Nine-colored heavenly lake, great path heavenly voice. It seems that someone has achieved supreme will. Who is it? So it's him. It seems that he's not arrogant. but I wonder what kind of supreme Tao insight he has attained. Although he had mastered a few top-level will, they could not be compared to a supreme will. It was like comparing a firefly to the moon. There was only one moon, and no matter how many fireflies there were, they could not compare. That was the essential difference. Supreme will. The underworld crown prince clenched his fists even tighter, his eyes reddened, and his breathing became hurried. After a while, he gradually calmed down. I can also grasp the supreme Tao intent. The few types of top-grade Tao intents that I have grasped have all been cultivated to the extreme. As long as I properly cultivate the inheritance of the Slaughter Sword Tao and combine it with my own top-grade Tao intents, I will definitely be able to grasp the supreme Slaughter Tao intent. Previously, his understanding of the Dongting Sword Mountain was limited. He thought that he could become a sword master by obtaining many sword seals. It was not until he entered the Dongting Sword Mountain that he realized it was not that simple. The Underworld Crown Prince was in a better mood. He had entered the Massacre Tao College, and it just so happened that the top-level will that he cultivated was quite compatible with the Massacre Tao College. As long as he worked hard, there was a slight possibility that he could fuse and transform the top-level will and finally achieve the Massacre Tao will and master the Supreme Will. Although it was only a slight possibility, he had to do it no matter what, even if he had to pay a huge price or use unscrupulous means. Chunzong was completely immersed in the transformation of the will and was unaware of everything that was happening in the outside world. The deity ocean still existed. The feeling of being blown into nothingness was just a feeling. Within the deity ocean, the heart sword intent vibrated gently. On the other side, heaven and earth were rotating. Inside, there was a clear distinction. The sun, moon, and stars, rivers, lakes, and seas, mountains, and vegetation. It was just like a world, except that there were no living creatures. However, in the next breath, there seemed to be chattering noises that sounded, as well as continuous roars. Birds gathered and flew into the forest, flying into the sky. Beasts on the ground roared, running between the grass and trees in the wilderness as fast as lightning. With the presence of birds and beasts, this world suddenly had more movement and vitality. It was as if this was a real world. Chunzong observed and felt carefully. This was the second will that he had mastered. The second supreme will. Supreme will meant the ultimate level of the will. Chunzong, who had mastered a supreme will, was very clear about the power of the supreme will. In fact, in terms of talent in other aspects, there was still a gap between him and the geniuses from the top forces. After all, his background and bloodline were ordinary because his parents were ordinary. If it were not for his powerful soul and extraordinary comprehension, he would have faded into the crowd. How could he have been so successful? He had his shortcomings, but he also had his advantages. His background was his weakness, his bloodline was his weakness, and his physique was his weakness. However, his soul was his advantage, his comprehension was his advantage, and so was his Tao will. That was why he was able to compete with the geniuses of the great forces in the void. Chapter 2053. Within the deity ocean, the chaos that was filled with destruction had completely disappeared and was replaced by a miniature of a world. Chunzong carefully sensed the mysteries within. It was the mysteries of forming a world of its own, which confused him. He originally thought that it would be a Tao will of destruction in the end, but it was not. Instead, it was the ultimate destruction and coincidentally integrated with the mysteries of creation. Chunzong could not help but ponder. The original Tao was yin and yang. The extreme of yin was yang, and the extreme of yang was yin. Chunzong recalled the situation when he was comprehending at the origin of the world in the Tianyuan sacred region. With yin and yang as the beginning, I comprehended the true meaning of life and death. The end of life is death, and the end of death is life. Life and death overlap. and become reincarnation. According to Chunzong's understanding, the Tao will that reached the ultimate reincarnation was also a supreme Tao will. But in the end, what he grasped was not a Tao will related to reincarnation. It was a brand new Tao will. Yin and yang, life and death, and reincarnation were integrated with the mysteries of the wind, fire, and thunder Tao will, as well as the mysteries of various Tao wills comprehended from the origin of the world. There were thousands of Tao wills. In the end, the ultimate destruction was the end, and the ultimate mirage was the beginning. It's like a world. Since that's the case, I'll call it the World Tao Will. Chunzong did not dwell on it too much. The World Tao Will was the second supreme Tao will after the heart soar intent. It had amazing potential, but now, Chunzong did not know how powerful the World Tao Will was. He had to discover it himself, which seemed to be more difficult than discovering the potential of the heart soar intent. Ignoring the heart soar intent, Chunzong used his mind to guide the power of the World Tao Will. A roar suddenly sounded, but did not spread out. It could only be heard in the deity ocean. A unique power was immediately mobilized by Chunzong. It spread out and condensed in his finger. With a light tap of his finger, an extremely shocking rumbling sound rang out. It felt as if an entire world had descended upon this world, directly suppressing the void. Suppress. Chunzong was slightly stunned. Is this the might and profundity of the World Tao insight? The profundities of the heart's sword insight lay in controlling at will, extraordinary perception, and all-conquering sharpness. Could it be that the profundities of this World Tao insight lay in suppression? Other than suppression, was there anything else? Chunzong couldn't help but ponder. Grasping a supreme Tao insight was delightful. Yet if he was unable to unearth its profundities and might, then it would be like possessing a mountain of treasures, yet being unable to excavate it, and it would only increase his worries. Chunzong estimated that he would have to spend a lot of time and energy on the Tao will of the world in the future. If he wanted to break through to the spirit realm, at least, he had to develop all of his powers to the acme. That way, his foundation wouldn't be shaky. It wasn't easy to break through the spirit realm. Since ancient times, there had been so many outstanding warriors who had failed to break through because of a little carelessness. The consequence of failure was most likely death. Although there were a few exceptions who could survive, they would never have the chance to break through again in their lifetime. After grasping the second supreme Tao insight, the World Tao insight, Chunzong had been unearthing its potential at every moment. However, Chunzong was soon summoned. Moreover, he was summoned by Sword Master Dong Ting, which surprised Chunzong very much. Junior of swordsmanship, what is the supreme Tao insight that you have grasped? A voice that seemed to be restrained, but also seemed to be endlessly domineering and sharp, sounded from the void. World Tao insight, Chunzong replied. World Tao insight. What kind of Tao insight is this? The voice seemed to have some doubts. Show me the power of your Tao insight. Chunzong didn't refuse. After all, he was also very curious about the World Tao insight. Moreover, the other party was Sword Master Dong Ting, the supreme expert of Sword Mountain Dong Ting, and also one of the supreme experts in the void. Perhaps he could see something and give some advice. It would be very beneficial. Chunzong mobilized a trace of the power of the World Tao insight. Suddenly, the outline of a world seemed to appear around him, which caused a surprised gasp. Immediately, Chunzong felt that the trace of the power of the World Tao insight was out of his control. It was controlled by Sword Master Dong Ting, who existed in an unknown place. Chunzong didn't speak. He waited quietly, feeling a little nervous. Sword Master Dong Ting was an expert of the Void Dominator realm. It was impossible for him not to be nervous after being summoned by such an expert. After a while, Chunzong felt that the power of the World Tao insight was back in his control again. What a strange Tao insight. It ends in destruction and begins in creation. However, your World Tao insight is still very shallow. The sun, the moon, the stars, the rivers, the lakes, the mountains, the birds, and the beasts are all illusory. They only have the appearance, but not the essence. They are not real. This Tao insight has amazing potential. It has formed a world of its own. Its future depends on your own cultivation and mastery. If you master it well, it may become the top supreme Tao insight. If you don't master it well, it will only be ordinary. I can't give you any advice for this new Tao insight. Everything depends on your own exploration. Sword Master Dong Ting's words directly penetrated Chun Zong's heart. Chun Zong heard it clearly. Although there wasn't any profound content or clear guidance, Chun Zong still heard it clearly. The World Tao insight was a new Tao insight. Even Sword Master Dong Ting had never heard of it. Another point was that the World Tao insight had amazing potential. However, whether it was a dragon or a snake depended on one's own ability. If one couldn't develop it to the extreme, then perhaps it only had the title of Supreme Tao Insight. Its true power might not reach the level it should be. However, if one mastered it well, there was hope for it to surpass other Supreme Tao Insights. After being summoned by Sword Master Dong Ting, Chun Zong was successively summoned by the Destruction Tao Academy Masters and the Reverie Mirage Tao Academy Masters. They were all curious about the Supreme Tao Insight that Chun Zong had mastered. Unfortunately, they couldn't give any effective advice. Everything depended on Chun Zong's own comprehension, cultivation, and exploration. Chun Zong felt that the best way to explore the potential and power of the World Tao Insight was to use a sword technique. Sword technique was a skill. It was a profound application and exploration of power. If there was a corresponding sword technique, he could further explore the potential and power of the World Tao Insight. Unfortunately, there wasn't. He could only create it himself. After spending a few months, Chun Zong finally created a suitable sword technique. World, descend. With a low shout, Chun Zong slashed out with his sword. The power of the Tao, will of the world, surged endlessly as he slashed out. That was a beam of sword chi, but it was also a world. It directly descended, suppressing everything. Its might was incomparably shocking. Time passed. Unknowingly, 2 years had passed. Chun Zong and dozens of others had come to Dongting Sword Mountain for 2 years. Dongting Sword Mountain was worthy of being called a top force. The inheritance was amazing. In the 2 years of cultivation, everyone's strength had improved significantly. The dozens of new disciples were all gathered, regardless of whether they were true disciples or nominal disciples. Chun Zong seemed to have become the center of attention because everyone knew that Chun Zong had grasped the Supreme Tao Insight. What was a Supreme Tao Insight? They all knew that it was the pinnacle of Tao Insight. It was the Tao Insight that was closest to the Great Path. To put it bluntly, Tao Insight was a path to the Great Path. The higher the level of Tao Insight, the closer it was to the Great Path. The smoother the path was, the easier it was to come in contact with the Great Path, and then take the step to truly understand and master the Great Path. A Supreme Tao Insight was very close to the power of the Great Path. There is even a rumor that when the potential of a Supreme Tao Insight was excavated to the extreme, one could even master a trace of the corresponding power of the Great Path in advance, even if it was just a trace. However, from ancient times until now, there were very, very, very few people who could truly achieve this step. Dongting Sword Mountain has its own great opportunity. Any disciple has the opportunity to obtain it. A middle-aged man appeared in front of the dozens of disciples. He was a true disciple of Sword Mountain. The structure of Dongting Sword Mountain was relatively simple. The highest position was the Sword Master, followed by the 4 Hall Masters, then the Deputy Hall Masters, and then the Elders. Under the Elders was the Sword Sun. The Sword Sun was also part of the scope of disciples. Under the Sword Sun were the true disciples. Under the true disciples were the nominal disciples. I am the 18th true disciple of Starry Tao Academy. You can call me Senior Brother Wan Xing. The middle-aged man's tone was serious, and there was a sense of vigorous power in his voice. Dongting Sword Mountain recruited disciples every time, and the interval was long and short. The shortest period was a few hundred years, and the longest period was a few thousand years. The number of disciples recruited each time was different, but it was never more than 100. Furthermore, Sword Mountain had its own rules. Disciples could not stay in Sword Mountain all the time. If they did not make the corresponding progress and breakthrough within the stipulated time, they had to leave Sword Mountain. Therefore, there were so few disciples in daunting Sword Mountain. There were less than 1,000 of them, but every one of them was a true elite. The ranking of the true disciples was closely related to their strength. The stronger one was, the higher the ranking. The higher the ranking, the more benefits, of course, other than reputation. As for Chunzong and the other true disciples, they didn't have the title of true disciple. There was only one title, which was the new true disciples. Because they weren't at the spirit realm, only spirit realm experts were qualified to compete for the ranking. The sword master intercepted a sword principal origin from the void and sealed it in Sword Mountain. The core disciple Wan Xing said unhurriedly. His deep and powerful voice was like the beat of a drum. However, the words he said shocked everyone. Origin. Sword principal origin. It was the sword principal origin that was intercepted directly from the void. There was an origin in the void, as well as in the stars and the world. They were all origins, but there was a difference between strong and weak. There was no doubt that the void origin was more vast and powerful than the world origin. Your opportunity is to comprehend the sword principal origin. Wan Xing's words made everyone's breathing quicken, and they were excited. They were extremely excited. Comprehend the sword principal origin. Chapter 2054. Sword Principal Origin. What a treasure. What a great opportunity. Chunzong was very excited. Just by comprehending the world origin of Tianyuan's sacred realm, he had gained great benefits. Tianyuan's sacred realm was just a declining world that had yet to recover. However, the sword principal origin of Sword Mountain was the sword principal origin of Void. The difference between the two was like the difference between a firefly and the moon. Of course, there was one thing that was worth considering. The higher the level, the greater the gap between the sword principal origin and the demigod level. Naturally, the gains from comprehending the sword principal origin would be smaller. The sword principal origin of Void was actually more suitable for ascending realm sword cultivators to comprehend. However, demigod-level geniuses would more or less gain something from comprehending the sword principal origin. It would also be very beneficial for them to advance to the ascending realm in the future. Although there is a sword principal origin in Sword Mountain, it is not something that can be comprehended as one wishes. Wan Xing's disciple said in a deep voice. His eyes were as bright as stars as they slowly swept across everyone's faces. He took in everyone's expressions. Sword Mountain has always been about survival of the fittest. If you're not capable, you will lose the opportunity and eventually leave. His words caused everyone's expression to turn solemn. Because of the philosophy of Sword Mountain, there were less than 1,000 people in Sword Mountain. However, every one of them was an expert. Even if they were not very powerful at the moment, they all had extraordinary potential and talent. As sword cultivators, regardless of talent, comprehension, or potential, we have to rely on our strength. Wan Xing's disciple said solemnly, "The sword is a sharp weapon. It is good for fighting and killing. Otherwise, it is just an empty shell. It is better not to practice it." Everyone understood. Some people were indeed extremely talented. Cultivating for a single day was equivalent to cultivating for 10 days or even longer than others. However, they just had to know how to cultivate, but not how to use it. Once they fought with others, they would not be able to use it flexibly and would not be able to display the strength they should have. In the end, they would become a stepping stone for others to build their reputation. Some people might have ordinary talent in cultivation, but they were able to fully display every bit of their strength and everything they had learned, and their combat prowess surpassed their limits. It was important for a cultivator to be talented and have great potential. However, they needed sufficient combat strength to live their life peacefully. It could be said that cultivation was the foundation, while combat strength was the means to protect the Tao. If you want to ascend to a higher level, pry into the mysteries of a higher realm, and transcend everything, you can. However, the prerequisite is that you must have enough ability to protect yourself. If you don't have enough ability to protect yourself, you will die very easily. What's the point of seeking the Tao or transcending? This was especially true for swordsmen. As a swordsman, one should have a sharpness to them. Where did that sharpness come from? From cultivation to tempering. Cultivation was to practice the sword. Tempering was to fight. That was what the myriad star true inheritance said in a few short sentences. On the Eastern Court Sword Mountain, there is 100 battles and 100 kills platform. 1 battle and 1 kill is a step, and 1 step is 10 feet. Only when you reach the peak of 1,000 feet can you go to the Sword Tao origin and comprehend it. The myriad star heir said in a serious voice, "Now, follow me." The arena of 100 battles and kills, Chunzong muttered. He had never heard of it before. 1 battle and 1 kill was a step, and each step was 10 feet. This was quite interesting. Not long after, dozens of nominal disciples and true disciples followed the myriad star heir to the so-called arena of 100 battles and kills. It was 100 stairs, one level after another. It looked very ordinary. Each staircase was 10 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 10 feet high. It looked like it was made of stone slabs covered with moss. If it was placed elsewhere, perhaps people would feel that it was very ordinary and wouldn't take a second look at it. However, this was the Eastern Court Sword Mountain. Everything was extraordinary. Sometimes, the more ordinary something looked on the surface, the more extraordinary it was. When they really walked to the bottom of the arena of 100 battles and kills, they looked up and found that there seemed to be layers of fog surging, covering everything. They couldn't see the end at all. It was like a staircase to the sky, endless. When they looked at the first staircase, a mysterious feeling spread out. It was as if it wasn't a staircase, but a world. Start from the nominal disciples. Remember, only by passing through the arena of 100 battles and kills and reaching the top will you be qualified to comprehend the Sword Tao origin. The myriad star heir said in a deep voice and swept his gaze across. You must remember that the demigod rank is a rank with endless potential. Even if your cultivation is raised to the extreme, you can still continue to improve in other aspects. The more you improve, the greater the benefits it will bring to your future cultivation. The demigod rank had endless potential. Chunzong had already felt this point. For example, if one cultivated a sword art, even if it was only at the lesser divine ability level, the more one cultivated it, the more compatible it would be with one's own Tao will, and so on. The power that could be exerted would continuously increase, making one's overall strength even more astonishing. Of course, endless was just a description. If one really cultivated it, one would reach the true limit sooner or later. However, in the demigod rank, there were very few who could reach the true limit. Let me give it a try. A nominal disciple said with a confident smile on his face. Outside of Sword Mountain, in the galaxy where he was located, he was fully deserving of the title of #1 genius. Even in the entire star field, he was well known. Very few people could compare with him. Now that he had been in Sword Mountain for 2 years, his strength had increased significantly compared to before. Confidence came from strength. The increase in strength brought with it greater confidence. He felt that he could definitely pass through the arena of 100 battles and kills. However, dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. First floor, second floor, third floor. Not long after, the nominal disciple reached the 10th staircase. Just looking from the outside, no one could see anything mysterious. They only saw the nominal disciple taking a step forward and starting to climb the staircase. However, after reaching the 10th staircase, his climbing speed began to decrease. When he reached the 20th staircase, he stopped. When he reached the 30th staircase, his speed dropped again. This time, it took him 10 breaths to climb to the 31st floor. Then, it took him 20 breaths to climb to the 32nd floor, and finally stopped at the 35th floor. With a flash of light, the nominal disciple appeared below the staircase of the arena of 100 battles and kills. I I actually failed. The nominal disciple looked very depressed. This was undoubtedly a heavy blow. Then, the second nominal disciple began to challenge the arena of 100 battles and kills and stopped at the 37th floor. Third, fourth, fifth, failure, failure, failure. All of them failed. All of the nominal disciples had failed. Not a single one of them had passed. The highest was the 50th floor, and the lowest was the 33rd floor. As such, the group of direct disciples all looked solemn. This arena of 100 battles and kills was so difficult to pass. Could they pass? For a moment, everyone was not so confident in their hearts. One by one, they failed. The myriad star direct disciple did not say anything, and his expression did not change. It seemed that it was very normal. Let me try. Jian Kuang laughed, leaped, and landed on the first staircase. Soon, he stepped into the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor. Jian Kuang's speed was very fast. The 20th floor, the 30th floor, the 40th floor. Soon, he stepped into the 60th floor. But after reaching the 60th floor, Jian Kuang's speed decreased slightly. The group of nominal disciples was immediately dumbfounded. It turned out that this was the gap between them and the direct disciples. They who had already passed the arena of 100 battles and kills knew very well that the test of the arena of 100 battles and kills was real. There was no trick at all. Each floor was more difficult than the previous. The difficulty of the 60th floor was definitely far greater than the 50th floor. Jian Kuang did not stop at the 60th floor. After a period of time, he stepped into the 70th floor. Although his speed decreased again, he still continued to go up. The 71st floor. The group of nominal disciples' faces became more and more solemn. Was the gap really so obvious? In the end, Jian Kuang did not pass the arena of 100 battles and kills and stopped at the 78th floor. I actually failed. Jian Kuang was not depressed like those nominal disciples. He was just a little disappointed. Immediately, he looked at the myriad star direct disciple. Senior brother Wan Xing, is there still a chance in the future? Yes. Those who have not passed will have a chance every year in the future. After this time, there are 9 more chances. If you have not passed the arena of 100 battles and kills, you can only leave the Dongting Sword Mountain, Wan Xing said solemnly. Leave the Sword Mountain? Yes, you will be expelled. Wan Xing's tone was very solemn. Expelled. This was probably a kind of regret. Swordsmen all yearned for such a holy land of swordsmanship. Who would be willing to be expelled? Suddenly, all of them were full of energy. Moreover, there were still 9 more chances after this failure. Could it be that they still could not pass the arena of 100 battles after using up all 9 times? If that was the case, it proved that they were indeed not outstanding enough. They did not need to be expelled by the Dongting Sword Mountain. They would have to leave in shame. Ha! Next time, I will definitely be able to pass. Jian Kuang looked very confident. The other direct disciples also tried one by one, but they all failed. Some made it to the 75th floor, while others made it to the 80th floor. Chenzong, do you dare to compete with me? Ming Luo Crown Prince stared at Chenzong as if his eyes were going to pierce through Chenzong. His tone was also filled with astonishing sharpness. In the country of Fujian, he fought with Chenzong in the Fujian mountain and was defeated in the end, which made Ming Luo Crown Prince feel bitter. If he did not win back, he would feel very uncomfortable. And now, the arena of 100 battles and kills might be a good opportunity. Now, only Ming Luo Crown Prince and Chenzong had not yet tried the arena of 100 battles and kills. Okay, Chenzong did not say anything, but agreed very briskly. Both sides did not mention any wager. You first or me? Ming Luo Crown Prince snorted and asked. You first. Chenzong smiled slightly and said, I am afraid of hurting you. You have a sharp tongue. With a cold snort, Ming Luo Crown Prince turned around and directly landed on the first floor. In less than a breath's time, he immediately stepped onto the second floor, the third floor, and the fourth floor. He continuously rushed up at an astonishing speed. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.